Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 365. It is the end of August, so it is of course the Patreon Drydock. Plenty of questions to be answered, so let's get on with answering them. Paul Frederick asks, the West Virginia was heavily damaged at Pearl Harbor and the Navy invested much time and money on repairing and renovation. She didn't return to service until September 1944. Was this a good investment of time and materials? After all, by the end of 42, the North Carolinas and South Dakotas were coming online, and it was getting to be quite clear that the 21-knot standards weren't going to be able to keep up with the carriers and would be mostly shore bombardment units. It seems there were enough surviving standards to handle the bombardment work, so was part of the decision to rebuild the ship just a matter of pride? There certainly was a certain amount of pride involved in fixing up and returning to service the most battered of the Pearl Harbor veterans. Because, honestly, the time and money spent in salvaging and repairing West Virginia probably could have been put into the production of other ships that might have then been available sooner and been somewhat more useful. I mean, the, roughly speaking, 2.5 years it took to salvage the West Virginia and then return her to service, you're talking about roughly the same amount of time as it would take to build an Alaska or a South Dakota, assuming you keel laid about the same time. In fact, USS Alaska is actually a very good comparison because she has a keel laid in the same month as the Pearl Harbor attacks, and she commissions around about the same time that West Virginia commissions, or recommissions in West Virginia's case. However, it's not just pride, because for one thing, West Virginia needed to be salvaged regardless of what you were going to do with her afterwards, because she was occupying a lot of critical space at the anchorage in Pearl Harbor. So that part of the equation was always going to happen, regardless of anything else. And also, to be fair, it's not just shore bombardment for the old standards. Yes, they're not going to keep up with the carrier groups. That's fairly obvious, but even with the North Carolinas, the South Dakotas, and later the Iowas coming online, there is a limited number of US fast capital ships because they can't have every single one of them on the front line all the time. They are going to have some that are going to need refits, repairs, refueling, restocking, etc. And if you're playing a very careful game, if you're US intel analyst, for example, you know that the Japanese have at least Yamato and Musashi around by the time the Pacific campaign is well underway. Yes, okay, you don't realize they are the 70,000-ton, 18.1-inch armed giants that they are, but you still think that they're probably at least 40 to 45,000-tonner 16-inch gun ships. So potentially they're actually marginally superior to a North Carolina or a South Dakota, according to your intel, because they have a similar level of armament, but with potentially 5 to 10,000 tons more displacement. In theory, they're either going to be faster or potentially much more heavily protected. Nagato and Mutsu, okay, they're not as well protected. They're not quite as quick, but they're still relatively quick, and they have 16-inch guns. And while the Congos might as well be armoured with paper for all that they can protect themselves against 16-inch gunfire, they are still fast, and their 14-inch guns are still more than capable of taking down carrier escorts and carriers. So collectively, that means you've got to think about the Japanese potentially having up to 8 fast capital ships that you know that they've got. And then you have the somewhat more questionable intel about them potentially having a bunch of 12-inch armed battlecruiser analogues, at which point the numbers of fast battleships that you have, while substantial, don't really allow you to do much with those fast battleships by the mid part of the Pacific War, other than carrier escort. Because if the Japanese throw everything you think you know they have at you in a surface action, you're going to need every fast battleship on the front line to defend those carriers. Now, that might sound fairly fine and logical, but if you're on the offensive, you also have all your amphibious forces, and the carriers and the amphibious forces can't always necessarily be in exactly the same place. And if the Japanese do send in a big surface attack, and if they do have air cover so that your carriers can't knock them out immediately, well, you can protect one or the other but not both, and if the Japanese have any sense and a decent amount of aerial recon, they'll go after the one you're not protecting. So you need something to protect the others. And that means basically, guess what the standards are going to end up doing, as well as shore bombardment. They're going to be protecting your amphibious groups because, let's face it, the amphibious groups don't move very fast, so the standards lower speed doesn't matter so much. And if you're going to use standards to defend those amphibious groups, well, if there's a possibility of either a large contingent of modern or modernized Japanese capital ships showing up, or at least some of them, then you need the heaviest guns and the best armor possible, and the Colorado class are pretty much that box ticked very nicely. Because a Colorado against Nagato or Mutsu, where the Colorado's fighting defensively, which negates to a certain degree the Japanese speed advantage, I'm going to put my money on the Colorado class, assuming that both vessels have been modernized. And even against a Yamato as they understood it, as I said, 40 to 45,000 tons and 16-inch guns, while the Colorado would be at a disadvantage, it could still put up a decent fight, perhaps enough for the convoy to get away, or the amphibious assault fleet to get away. And if there's more of the standards than there are of the Japanese, potentially even win. So if you've got, say, all three Colorados and the Tennessees and the New Mexicos, then if the Japanese show up with, say, a couple of what your intel thinks the Yamatos are and a Nagato, because perhaps Mutsu and the Congos have been caught by the fast battleships, well, there's strength in numbers and you might actually win that engagement and maybe even win it without losing too many ships. So there's definitely a role for West Virginia, at least at the time they start refitting her. Now, granted, by the time she actually enters service, the prospect of such a large Japanese surface force, breaking through and smashing up an invasion fleet is much diminished, mostly by the fact the Japanese don't have such a surface force left anymore. But as we see with the Battle of Surigao Strait, there's still a risk of a lesser force coming in. And again, maintenance issues mean that however many standards you have, you can only have a percentage of them on the front line at any given time. So having West Virginia available means that, well, that's an additional hull that you can have on the front line. And as the US Marines and the US Army would tell you, there's no such thing as too much shore bombardment. So there's still even in the late part of the war, there is still a certain degree of sense in having West Virginia around, even if some of the justification that was perhaps around at the start of her refit has gone away. And ultimately, although it does take about the same amount of time to build and commission a brand new ship, capital ship, as it does to salvage and refit West Virginia, the fact of the matter is that's kind of, it's a little of a bit of an artificial thing because we're starting at the same point, whereas if you're actually going to build from new, you do have to commission long lead items like your power plant and the guns well ahead of that, which obviously they probably wouldn't have known about. Manani Wanderer asks, keel hauling, how common was it? And if someone miraculously survived, was it treated how the Catherine wheel breaking was? Well, I don't know too much about the Wheel of St. Catherine other than it was a pretty horrific execution method on land. But so I'm assuming from the context of the question that if somebody survived that, they would kind of be, okay, well, it has been decided that you live or something like that. But with keel hauling, at least in the time period that the channel mainly covers, it definitely exists and it definitely does happen, but it's a lot less common than it sometimes appears in popular lore. Most of the references to keel hauling that we have are either where it's on a statute book as a punishment, or someone's referring to it as a punishment, i.e. they're saying this could be done, but as opposed to here is an example of it being done. Or we have examples where someone says, on such and such a ship on such and such a date, a keel hauling happened. Can you explain or justify it? Because it was seen as a pretty harsh punishment for obvious reasons. And most often the people involved are like, no, we didn't do that. Why the heck do you think we did that? There's plenty of other things that we could have done. We didn't do that. He wasn't that bad. So while there are, as I said, a few evidenced accounts, like you can see this one, this is a commemoration by painting of a keel hauling. It kind of tells you how rare keel hauling was. The fact that when it happened, there was quite a lot of people showed up to see it. But while it was understood that keel hauling very well might kill you, either by massive laceration, blunt force trauma, or drowning, it wasn't, strictly speaking, an execution method the way that the Wheel of St. Catherine was definitely supposed to kill you. So if you were convicted of something so horrific that you were keel-hauled, no one was particularly going to shed many tears about you dying if you happened to die during it, but that wasn't the objective. The objective was extreme punishment, but extreme punishment more for the purposes of pointing out to everybody else as a deterrent, don't do what this person did because otherwise this would happen to you. Because there were plenty of, dare I say it, far more practical ways of either horrifically punishing somebody, like flogging them mercilessly, or if you really wanted to actually just convict them and execute them, you could just shoot them. As a form of practical punishment, keel-hauling is hilariously ineffective, but as a form of setting a horrific deterrent to everybody, it is incredibly effective. But of course, as with most horrific deterrents, you have to use it sparingly, otherwise it just becomes day-to-day practice and it actually ends up losing a lot of its deterrent effect. So if somebody was keel-hauled, it would be a case of, oh, they survived, fine, patch them up, and, they'll report for duty as soon as they're healed. And in some ways, actually someone surviving a keel-hauling would be better for the deterrent effect than if they died. Because if they died, well, as I said, there were quite a lot of ways of somebody being killed by a form of punishment in the Age of Sail Navy, flogging around the fleet, for example, or just shooting them. But if somebody went through the horrific experience of being keel-hauled and then survived and then spent weeks in agony being patched up and was most likely, at least in some way, shape or form, crippled for life as a result of it afterwards, and then was around as a kind of a living example and could tell everyone how bad it was, that's actually going to be a massive multiplier to the deterrent effect of don't do something that might provoke the powers that be to keel-haul you. Nick Brodar asks, every so often, the idea that Admiral King coerced the British into the D-Day landings by threatening to take his ball and go home pops up. Is there any evidence to support this assertion? As far as I can tell, there doesn't seem to be any real evidence to support that idea. King definitely did seem to have doubts as to whether the British would go for an actual cross-channel invasion at all, and there were discussions about various cross-channel invasion attempts from 1942, and then in 1943, and then, of course, finally actually happened in early 44. But the single biggest driver for opening specifically a front in northwestern Europe seems to have actually been Stalin. As far as I can tell from what King seems to have said about the various plans, apart from his doubts that the British would do it at all, King seems to have been of the opinion that, well, if we want to go after Germany primarily, and obviously that was a political decision, King honestly probably would have been happier with a Pacific first thing, because that was very much obviously a fully American show for the most part. But if his attitude seems to be, well, if we're going to go after Germany first, then we probably should go after Germany. But if you're not going to go after Germany, or you're going to go after Germany by kind of roundabout ways with things like Operation Torch and Husky and so forth, well, then clearly you don't need quite as many ships, quite as many landing craft, etc. Therefore, I'm going to take those and use them in the Pacific. So I think that's perhaps where occasionally people get the idea that King was going to take his ball and go home, basically because whenever a major landing attempt in or around Europe was put forward, if it wasn't going to be the full-on cross-channel invasion, as soon as that became clear, King just kind of turned around and went, right, then those landing craft that you clearly don't need are mine. So he was, to a certain extent, taking stuff and going home, but was reasonably justified in doing so. The other thing, I think, is that in the immediate run-up to the actual invasion, so Operations Overlord and Neptune, King also was under a certain degree of the impression that, well, the US is supplying the troops and a bunch of the landing craft, and clearly, since it's northwestern Europe, the British should supply almost everything else with things like naval gunfire support. And initially seems to have been a little bit annoyed that the British weren't just committing the entirety of their surface fleet to Overlord, because as far as the British were concerned, obviously, yes, that we're talking about early to mid 44, Germany's not in the best state, but Germany still has a degree of a surface fleet. The convoys are still very important to the British, and so the home fleet is a reasonable strength being maintained in case the Germans make some kind of break to try and hit the Atlantic convoys and other things. And so, no, not all the British ships that are technically available are going to be sent to D-Day, which in part is why King releases some of his older ships like Texas and so forth to go and essentially fill a gap that he had assumed the British were going to fill. And apart from anything, as I said, the whole bit about invading Western Europe was a political decision taken at the highest levels by, well, the Allies as a whole, and in the US specifically, obviously, the President and the Joint Chiefs. So King wasn't really in a position to completely threaten to take his ball and go home anyway, because if he did, then, well, his superiors would have turned around and said, knock it off. I am making this up as I go asks, while visiting the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, I had the pleasure of seeing the lovingly restored PT-305 in all her glory. She saw action in the Mediterranean. When I asked about the mortar mounted on her bow, a museum guide explained it was used in the original boat to fire flares behind enemy barges, backlighting them for easier targeting. Upon closer inspection of photographs of the restored boat, this appears to be an M2 60mm mortar that looks suspiciously like it could have been a field modification to the original. Given that the PT boat crews were notorious for their creative acquisitions, much like how PT-305's crew reportedly enhanced their accommodation with portholes liberated from nearby wrecked yachts, I'm curious about the provenance of this particular piece of kit. Would you care to enlighten us as to whether this mortar was a factory installation, a standard theatre modification, or another example of the PT boat's legendary talent for making unauthorised improvements to their vessels? Well, this mortar is 99.999% undoubtedly a field modification by the crew. PT boats, MGBs, the British ones, and Schnellboot, the German ships or boats, they're kind of really weird examples of, much as I hate to say it, but almost national characteristics without getting too stereotypical, because Schnellbooter tended to be fitted with fairly standard armaments, and while there are some small examples of them having field mods done by their crews, that's very rare, and also those modifications tend to be more in the form of, we've got some 20mm guns, I'm going to put an additional 20mm or something on there, just minor expansions on the originals. British MGBs start off reasonably heavily armed, and while there is a fair bit of scrounging and field modification, it tends to get very quickly adapted. So the guys, back in port are very enthusiastic about adopting the idea of putting even more guns on the MGB. So you do get a very wide variety of armament, but a lot of it is theoretically at least standardized. Someone puts a 6-pounder on the bow and everyone else is like, ooh, I like this idea. Let us put 6-pounders on everything, and so on and so forth. Whereas with the PT boats, they exist in this kind of weird liminal space in between, in that initially the PT boats are supposed to be firing their torpedoes, and they have, a couple of twin 50 cals for mostly air defense, and that's about it. And then as the war goes on, very quickly they tend to get a 20mm Oerlikon, and that remains their standard official armament for a very, very long time. Towards the end of the war, there's widespread installation of at least a 40mm Bofors, but it does take some time for even that to bed in. But at the same time, while this does mean that towards the mid to late part of the war, the PT boats tend to have slightly heavier overall gun armaments than a lot of Schnellbooter, there is still a potential for some Schnellbooter to have a heavier gun armament than a US PT boat, assuming that they're both using whatever is passing for the standard fit-out at that time, whereas a British MGB is almost comically loaded up with firepower. But the US PT boat crews decide that they want more guns, and they will have more guns, whether they have to beg, borrow, or steal them. And so the USPT boats probably have the widest variety of guns fitted to them because the crews keep going out and finding all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Everything from, 37mm cannon, whether that be army ones or ones recovered from, shall we say, inoperable aircraft that have been made even more inoperable by the fact that somebody has stolen their cannon, all the way through to just additional 50 cals, 20 mils, 40 mils, because those are fairly common in Navy yards and people probably aren't going to miss them until the PT boats get well out to sea. Or, in this case, mortars, as well as other things like rocket launchers and light field artillery and all sorts of other wonderful things. But the interesting thing about that is that when you dig a little bit deeper, the PT boat field modifications, while they are very random on the face of it, there are common themes depending on the theatre the PT boat is operating in. So when you look at the PT boats, say in the mid to late part of the war, that are operating very offensively against Japanese forces, so perhaps raiding convoys, going after Japanese small warships and such, in those cases you tend to see field modifications that are more about increasing the sheer amount of firepower, so autocannon, that kind of stuff. When you're looking at PT boats that are operating more in coastal patrol and attack roles, that's when you see things like rocket launchers, light field guns, and so forth being brought in. And when you see the PT boats operating over in the European theatre, to a limited extent in the Channel, where they're operating mostly against Schnellboote, and in the Mediterranean, where they're having to fight Mars boats, but also have a fairly important convoy attack role, that's where you see a lot of the more interesting indirect field modifications, because obviously at that point, when they're going after larger ships that are perhaps less capable of defending themselves, they end up thinking less about just having lots of automatic firepower, although they do need some to counter air attack. They think more about improving their capability of launching torpedoes and such, and that's where you get things like flare-launching mortars. And of course, in the Mediterranean theatre, there's an awful lot of coastline with an awful lot of Allied troops in various places, and I'm sure they're not going to miss a mortar or two. Farrendo Ritter asks, Dr. Alex Clarke has made the argument that in Star Trek, the Starfleet officer corps doesn't make good sense. You have captains doing things that an admiral or his staff should do, and vice versa. What are your thoughts? If somehow Kirk, Picard, and Sisko came back in time to the Age of Sail or World War I or World War II, how do you think they'd fare as officers? I think the contradictions that Dr. Clarke points out come about partly because as the various Star Trek shows evolved, they took certain elements of the TOS setting, but I think to a certain degree they sometimes forgot why those elements were there. Because if you look at TOS, the original series, i.e. Kirk, that is very much the Age of Sail, but in space. They have communication time lags. You see them dropping subspace beacons just to be able to communicate at all. They're very much way out on the frontier, away from anything, at which point the fact that Kirk has a very much more expanded command and authority role as compared to a 20th century naval captain makes a lot of sense, because he's acting much more like an Age of Sail captain, where no, you can't refer back to Starfleet Command every 5 minutes to see what you want to do. You're basically the front line of the Federation. You have to represent your nation, and you have to make a lot of decisions, not just as a captain, but also as an ambassador, potentially even as a flotilla or fleet commander, if there happen to be other ships in the area. Of course, Enterprise is always the only ship available, so that part usually goes by the wayside. But when you get to Next Generation and DS9, you have the slightly weird paradox of they're retaining a lot of that very expanded command and control style, the Age of Sail command and control style from TOS, which, to be fair, does give the captains a lot more dynamic range in what they can and can't do on screen. But they also are adopting an awful lot of much more modern that practices, the fact that Picard can, by Next Generation, call up Starfleet Command, just because apparently the subspace network has been dramatically improved. I.e., he's got, more, not even World War One, but World War II or later degrees of communication with home capability. And Sisko, obviously, being of roughly the same time period, is in pretty much the same boat. Plus, he's actually got a whole base going with DS9, at which point you, in theory, if you're going to keep that level of communication going, you should see Picard and Sisko restricted more to the kind of command decisions that a World War II or early Cold War captain would be making, with obviously therefore a much more limited role compared to a Age of Sail, Ironclad, or even World War One captain. Because even in World War One, you didn't have worldwide radio communications nets. You were still, to a certain degree, on your own. You'd have to go towards a friendly port and either make radio communications a couple of hundred miles away from there, or visit a port and use a telegraph. So even in World War One, ship captains had a lot more autonomy and a broad scope of authority than they would do even 2 decades later. So from a modern naval perspective, I think that's where you get the conflict with the Next Generation DS9 era, because you're looking at people operating in a setting that, at least from a command control communication perspective, is not too dissimilar to a modern setting, but they're acting in a way that suggests they're more like Age of Sail captains. Whereas in the modern era, as Dr. Clarke points out, you'd have an admiral and their staff doing that. Now, as far as the 3 captains go in terms of bringing them into our time and before, Kirk would be absolutely at home in the Age of Sail. Whether that be as a combat line officer, obviously in Star Trek you don't see all that much of it compared to the episodes of the week, but if you were to put Kirk in place of any one of numerous different long-distance explorers, maybe Anson's voyage, Drake's voyage if you go far enough back, or Captain Cook, something like that, Kirk would slot in absolutely perfectly and have a whale of a time in that setting, which isn't surprising because, as I said, that's pretty much what he was modelled on. Picard and Sisko are a little bit harder to pin down, because I think with Picard you've got almost 2 separate versions of Picard. You've got Picard of early to mid Next Generation, who the show desperately tries to portray more as a flying diplomat than a captain. And then you have the Picard of some of the later part of TNG and the TNG movie era, where mostly at Patrick Stewart's prodding, as far as I understand it, Picard was given a much more dynamic, action-oriented role. So version 1.0 Picard, I think, actually isn't going to make, as portrayed in the show at least, a particularly good naval officer through any of those eras in frontline combat duties. He probably would shine in the mid to late 19th century on something like the Franklin expedition, obviously not the doomed part of the Franklin expedition, but that kind of era where naval officers were being sent out in command of, technically speaking, naval ships, but they were going out primarily for scientific purposes. That would be a good period for version 1.0 Picard. And ironically, given the timeline of progression, version 2.0 Picard would be a ideal officer for the 1890s and 1900s, maybe even the late 1880s, as international tensions are building up more and more. But there's still a certain need for diplomacy, but also a need for a very decisive combat commander if push comes to shove. But, version 2.0 Picard would do very well in that period and then going into World War One. Sisko, however, and again, somewhat ironic considering the progression, we're talking about the progression of the series and we're also progressing through time, I think Sisko would be best placed in, I actually think, the Royal Navy, with his first commands coming about in the early 1920s, because I can see Sisko as a early commander, perhaps a commander of destroyers, or perhaps by the mid-30s being given command of a cruiser or small carrier, absolutely cutting his teeth on anti-piracy patrols in the China Sea, for example. And that kind of low-level but fairly aggressive command style and action, which would then put him in a position of being a well-known, fairly well spoken of captain by the time of the outbreak of World War II, at which point combine Cisco with a tribal class destroyer and send him out to Norway and the Mediterranean, gradually working his way. Cisco as then perhaps working up as commander of Force K at Malta, then perhaps being moved up to 10th Destroyer Flotilla, and then maybe being put in charge of the Arctic convoys for the hunting down of Scharnhorst. I'm pretty sure he'd find some way of getting Tirpitz to come out of the fjords and face her final doom. I think that's where Cisco would shine. Gallias of Martinengo asks, have non-English speaking navies also continued to use ship classifications that are based on late 1800 roles of vessels, such as cruiser, destroyer, etc.? For the most part, yes, although with some important qualifications. The reasons essentially come down to who was the most dominant navy in the late 19th and then early 20th centuries. When you're importing a lot of your ships from either that navy or the next largest navies, and the largest navies tend to have a relatively common consensus about what various ships are called, you tend to adopt it or a local version of it almost by default. And then, of course, as you get into the later part of the 20th century, when you get things like the overall NATO command structure, there's a further encouragement for even non-English speaking navies to adopt something that vaguely resembles a unified ship classification system, which of course means that you're going to be using the one that the British and the Americans have been using because they're the biggest navies in NATO or CETO or various other organizations. Now, where you do have some variation is in precise naming, because, for example, technically speaking, the Germans don't have battle cruisers. We call them battle cruisers. German speakers speaking English will refer to them as battle cruisers, but if you look at the actual World War I designations for things like Seydlitz, von der Tann, der Flinger, they are große Kreuzer, big cruisers. Now, there is no such thing as a big cruiser in English designations for naval ship designs, and they're not Panzerkreuzer, armoured cruiser. They are just große Kreuzer, big cruiser. But everyone understands that große Kreuzer and battle cruiser are basically the same kind of ship role, the same kind of ship slot, roughly, not exactly the same, but roughly similar design styles. And so they're just referred to generically as battle cruiser. Now, when you get further up to battleship, again, although you can have things, again, in German, like Schlachtschiff, which is literally battleship, you don't necessarily see that carried across to everybody. Again, they will have slightly different names, but it all relates to the same role. So collectively, at least translation-wise, you'll see them being used for the same basic ship. So if we call something a battleship, they call something different, but they'll understand what it is. So, for example, the Spanish don't have battleships, they have acorazado. Now, the thing with acorazado, which is a form of the term to armour, i.e. the implication, although not the direct translation, being armoured ship, acorazado can apply to ironclads as much as it can to pre-dreadnoughts, as much as it can to dreadnoughts. So, whereas in English we would have ironclad, pre-dreadnought, dreadnought, super dreadnought, the Spanish would just have acorazado, unless they're trying to mimic the English form for clarity or something like that. And it's actually also very similar in French. They have a term for their capital ships, which is derived from to armour or to be armoured, which again applies equally to ironclads, pre-dreadnoughts and dreadnoughts. But there are cases where there's some deviations, both in terms of terms overlapping somewhat beyond what the English-speaking audience would think as a specific designation, but also in terms of doctrinal classification. So, for example, the French, so far, don't really seem very big on the idea of destroyers. Of course, in World War I, World War II, you have torpilleurs, and contre-torpilleurs, rather than a unified destroyer category. And even nowadays, whilst under NATO designations the Horizon class is classified as an air defence destroyer, the French call it a frigate. While at the same time, so that's at the high end, they're calling something a frigate, everyone else would call it a destroyer, because these days destroyers are generally somewhat larger than frigates. But at the lower end of things in modern French naval combatants, they also have some ships which most people would call OPVs, but they are still calling frigates, because they tend to call pretty much almost anything that is a ship and is primarily a surface combatant as opposed to a carrier. They tend to call it some variation of frigate these days. Sapper Ninja asks, aerial refueling had already been trialled and used as early as the mid-20s. If the technology had been more developed and matured, how might World War II have changed? I don't think it's going to have quite as much of an impact as you might otherwise think, because most of the air war in World War II is, of course, being fought on land. And if you think about, either the bombing by the Germans in Britain, or the RAF bombing the Germans, or the Eastern Front, etc., etc., the vast majority of distance that's being covered is either over hostile airspace or within range of enemy fighters that could range out past what's technically the enemy border. There's actually a relatively short distance, a short amount of time, where you're operating in what you could term friendly airspace, where it'd be safe to refuel. And as such, the effort of doing all that aerial refueling for, another 50, 100 miles of range generally isn't worth it, coupled with the fact that you're launching raids of hundreds of aircraft, high dozens, 200s, possibly even many hundreds, and then you need, dozens or hundreds of tankers as well. All of that is a huge amount of logistical effort for not a huge amount of return. So outside of perhaps recon planes, where perhaps you might have a very specialist high altitude refueling platform that would then top up a recon plane once it's reached a very high altitude before it sets off, I don't really see aerial refueling having a huge impact on the land warfare side of things. And more generally, just because of the sheer scale of what you'd need in terms of refueling tankers and so forth, and the consequences of if something goes wrong. Whereas at sea, I think perhaps there could be some more actual impact of this technology, mostly in terms of recon aircraft, because of course, aerial recon, convoy escort, that kind of thing, you're not facing hostile aircraft in vast tracts of the areas that you're patrolling, and so you could have aerial refueling assets based out of forward areas to refuel flying boats and so forth to keep them running for longer. Although, of course, these aircraft are staying up in the air for quite a long time anyway. But to help bridge certain gaps and perhaps to extend ranges a little bit, there could be some assistance there. And because the numbers are lower as well, therefore, a dozen aerial refueling tankers based in Iceland would have a vastly disproportionate impact on Allied air cover over the convoys compared to a dozen aerial tankers vainly trying to, allow Lancasters to get a couple of extra cities deep into Germany or something like that. And then perhaps the other thing maybe would be mid to late war carrier operations. Early war, although there could be some theoretical utility in it, the fact is that early on, I don't think you have enough carriers and therefore enough aircraft to justify it, because if you're going to do air-to-air refueling, you're essentially sacrificing at least one airframe for each refueling thing you do. So even if you have one airframe that does refueling for 2 or 3 aircraft, if you've only got 30, 40 aircraft in a strike package, or you've only got 2 or 3 carriers out there, that's eating substantially into your strike force. Whereas by late 43, 44, for example, in the Pacific, if you're facing something like the prospect of that long-distance strike at the end of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, then in that circumstance, if you perhaps say, okay, we have several hundred aircraft at our disposal, we're going to put 3 dozen aircraft, maybe 3 dozen Avengers up with essentially a buddy refueling system, get everybody up off the deck, have the Avengers orbiting, take them out 100 or so miles, and then anyone who's below a certain level is going to get topped up while we're cruising. That then, admittedly, your strike package has been slightly reduced, but a strike package of arbitrarily, let's say 150 instead of 200 aircraft is still a very big strike package. And now they have more than enough fuel. They don't have to worry so much about running on fumes to get back to their carriers, which makes everything a lot safer. So in those circumstances, there could be some utility. And similar thing for perhaps going after Japanese land bases. If kamikaze strikes are getting to be particularly annoying, then, instead of hitting a base with 3 dozen strike aircraft, you have a dozen of them set up as buddy refuelers. You send 2 dozen strike aircraft, but your carriers can now stage out 100, 150 miles further away from the islands. You can refuel the aircraft, you can send them in, and then the aircraft can come back, and maybe even you can top them up on the way back if they've burned off a lot of fuel. So in those areas, it would be of some advantage, but I don't think it's going to massively change the overall conduct of the war. Matt Blom asks, my understanding of early 20th century naval history is that several members of the British Commonwealth helped to fund various ships, such as HMS Australia and New Zealand. But for other Commonwealth countries that did not fund a specific ship, were they still expected to contribute funds to Britain to help build up the Royal Navy? It really depends on the status of the nation or territory or whatever you want to call it in question. Because if the, let's say, land is fully part of the British Empire and is ruled either directly from Britain or by a governor appointed in Britain, then it just falls under the purview of the Royal Navy. So, finances are already being gained into the British economy, into the British Treasury as a result of having control of that place. Sometimes those finances are net negative, but whatever, it's still the Royal Navy's duty to protect them. But then you have this kind of grey area where you have the various dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Now, theoretically, they are free to do anything they want, spend as much or as little money as they want, but it's their own money. The only restriction they have as dominions, realistically, is in matters of foreign policy. So they still have to sort of march in lockstep with Britain on foreign policy. Now, during much of the time of the dominions being dominions, but also obviously the Royal Navy and the British Empire being the dominant power, they didn't expect much other than cooperation from those various nations because, well, the British Empire as a Gestalt entity could easily fund all the shipping that was needed. And if they wanted to send sailors to serve in the navies, then that was great. But as you got into the early 20th century and you have the rise of Germany, British naval spending is increasing, and also the concentration of British forces is increasing. Now you start to see issues because obviously as the British build up more and more and more to counter the threat of Germany, they're also pulling ships into the European theatre primarily to counter the threat of Germany. Now, where before a threat to the dominions was also a threat to the British Empire, therefore the Royal Navy would deploy its ships to protect those areas, therefore everybody was happy. But, for example, if you're worried about the Russians in the Pacific, which Australia and New Zealand historically quite were at the beginning of the 20th century, but Britain's just pulled the vast majority of its forces back to guard against Germany in the North Sea and the Atlantic, now there is a divergence of policy, because obviously the Australians and the New Zealanders, they're going to want a naval force to protect themselves in the Pacific. The British, however, are repurposing their forces to the North Sea, and there's not a lot that the Australians particularly could do about it because, well, it's not their ships. They're under the protection of the Royal Navy, but they're only under as much protection as the Royal Navy deems fit to give them. Conversely, if you have your own navy, the Royal Australian Navy, then you can have a lot more choice about when and where those ships are deployed. And similarly with Canada, and everywhere else, as time goes on, there is a sense that, okay, Britain can spend a lot on its navy, but if it's going to deploy its navy to counter the threat that it has deemed to be the most threatening, that may or may not coincide with what our policies think is the threat to us, or we might not be comfortable with the forces the Royal Navy can make available. And so there are two ways around that. One is you upgrade your own infrastructure and build your own fleet or buy your own fleet so that you have a lot more control over the amount and location of those forces, or you contribute money and ships to the Royal Navy to expand the Royal Navy generally, partially in the hopes of making the Navy as a whole strong enough that it can afford to now redeploy ships to guard you as well as protecting against what it perceives as its primary threat. And the different Commonwealths take different views on that. So they're not, strictly speaking, expected to contribute funds to Britain to build up the Royal Navy, but there is a certain, I wouldn't even necessarily say unspoken, but at least it's not written down formally in writing at the start. There is this general idea of Britain will do what is best for Britain and the Empire as far as Britain sees fit, and if you want to change that outside of making a request, you have to kind of cough up. So if you're not happy with the decision that the Royal Navy is making about its ship deployments, well, if you help fund the Royal Navy, then you have a bit more of a stake in it, and the Royal Navy might be more willing to listen to some of your requests. Now, during a set of imperial conferences in the 1900s, there was a little bit more codification towards general imperial cooperation, standardization, etc., etc. And certainly towards the end, there was the idea that everybody should, from the sort of the semi-independent dominion, should be doing a bit to contribute towards general imperial defense rather than just sort of basically sitting back and accepting defense that they weren't paying for. But if they were going to do that, and if so, how they were going to do that, was still very much down to them. Texas and LaShock asks, are there any accounts of or from the pilot who had to guide USS Missouri into Tokyo Bay, or any pilots who had to guide any of the other Allied ships in? There are certainly accounts about, and even a few pictures of, the pilot who guided Missouri into Tokyo Bay and the pilots who guided the various other Allied ships into Tokyo Bay at the end of World War II. However, I'm not entirely certain as to whether any of those pilots actually then wrote their experiences down or accounted for them later on in some other manner. It's certainly possible that they did, but if they did, it's almost certainly going to be in Japanese. And as I said, I'm not aware of their existence, but there are certainly plenty of references to them in Allied accounts and reports. Glenn Ricafrente asks, you recently said the modernisation of Royal Oak made her an even more effective frontline battleship than the lesser modernised Queen Elizabeth's, thus making her sinking in the early part of the war even more of a loss. Could you please explain why this is so? So there's two factors that go into why I say this. First is the time period that the three ships in question, Royal Oak, Barham and Malaya, were refitted. Barham was refitted last in terms of major refits in 1934. Well, she finished her refit in 34, whereas Royal Oak and Malaya finished their refits in 36. So Barham, by 1939, when war broke out, well, let's say 1940, because war breaks out at the end of 1939, effectively Barham has been at sea for 5 to 6 years without a major overhaul, whereas Royal Oak and Malaya have only been at sea for about 3. So that means Royal Oak is fresher than Barham mechanically. Now, another thing is that the changes that were made to Malaya and Barham dropped their speed. Now, it dropped their speed by different amounts, but essentially Royal Oak was within shouting distance of the speed of Barham and Malaya by the time all three ships had been refitted, so by the late 1930s, which meant that one of the big items of a Queen Elizabeth class, that being its somewhat speed advantage over the R's, wasn't really all that pronounced, if at all, between those three vessels. So you've got a ship that's slightly fresher than Barham, is going to be of approximately a similar speed, and then you look at the details of the actual refits. Now, everyone got bulges, everybody got better AA suites, etc. But Royal Oak got a better anti-aircraft refit than either Barham or Malaya. Initially, she had twice as many AA guns because she had twin 4-inch instead of single 4-inch. Now, granted, Barham and Malaya did have their single 4s replaced by twin 4s later in the 1930s, but Royal Oak also got a HAX Mark III anti-aircraft fire control system, as opposed to the HAX Mark I that Barham and Malaya got. So she had a more effective anti-aircraft director. There were also pom-poms and things like that. And then I think the thing that clinches it all for me is that Royal Oak also received quite significant up-armouring to her deck armour over her magazines and over her machinery, something that Malaya and Barham did not receive during that refit, which means that overall, Royal Oak might be a knot and a half slower than Barham or Malaya, but it's not really enough to make a huge amount of difference. But she has a more effective anti-aircraft fire control system, and she has better deck protection against bombs and long-distance shell fire. So if she ends up fighting the Scharnhorsts on a convoy escort mission, or she ends up under air attack in a more frontline role, she is going to be able to take that battering somewhat better, as well as, in the case of air attack, have a better chance of shooting down her attackers. And therefore, overall, she's going to be a slightly more effective combatant, at least in my view, than Barham or Malaya would have been, especially poor old Barham, who, as I said, would have been struggling along with a significantly longer amount of wear and tear on her systems at the start of World War II. Alex Moskovitz asks, I have some questions about why big shells have a longer range than small ones, courtesy of our dear friend the square cube law. First, if mass is proportional to volume, but air resistance is roughly proportional to surface area against the wind, does that imply that for two shells travelling at the same velocity, the larger diameter one travels further because it is longer? And secondly, if you put twice as much propellant in a gun, I assume you double the charge, but you also double the surface area of the barrel that's able to absorb the blast. Does this imply that there is something other than the barrel itself that is responsible for catastrophic gun failure as you increase the propellant charge? So for the first part of the question, length of shell can have an effect, especially what the shape of the shell is in terms of the length of the windscreen relative to the width of the shell, and also the shape of the back end of the shell. But it's not, if we're talking about mostly the difference in overall size and therefore mass, it's not so much the length of the shell, because obviously the bit that's going to encounter the most resistance as it plows through the air is going to be the frontal cross-section rather than the full length of it, although you obviously will get drag down the sides. It's more to do with kinetic energy and inertia, because as we know, kinetic energy is 1/2 mv squared. Obviously, if v is the same, velocity, so that part of the equation is constant in this scenario. But if the mass of one is bigger than the other, and so double the shell means 8 times the mass, then that's a whole lot more kinetic energy. But since area only increases by a square, that means that proportionally speaking, kinetic energy has gone up a huge amount more. And so your kinetic energy per unit area, or your if you like, is going to be a lot greater for the bigger shell. Therefore, if the air resistance is bleeding off a given amount per unit area of energy as it flies, the much, 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 much greater proportional kinetic energy of the larger shell just means it's going to keep its velocity up for a lot longer. So if we considered, for a very basic example, if we actually considered the shells as cubes, so if we had a 1 by 1 by 1 cubic shell, and then we double its dimensions, so it's now 2 by 2 by 2 cubic shell. So it now has 8 times the volume, but only 4 times the frontal surface area. So let's say the air resistance on the 1 by 1 by 1 cube is bleeding off energy at a rate of 1/10 of its overall speed per mile. Now, obviously, this is very arbitrary. Obviously, air resistance doesn't quite work that way. But let's say, for the sake of a simple explanation, that this is the case. Then after 10 miles, the shell is going to have run out of energy and it will hit the ground with 0 forward velocity. And that's assuming a shell that has a volume of 1 unit and a total amount of energy going forward of 1 unit. So we now have our 2 by 2 by 2 shell, so it now has 8 units of energy. Now, of course, because its frontal surface area has increased, it's now losing, instead of 1/10 of a unit of energy per mile, it's now losing 4/10 of a unit of energy per mile. In this case, again, we're neglecting the marginal frictional losses along the sides, or we're just incorporating it into our forward resistance. But if we're losing 0.4 per mile, and we've got 8 to start with, we're going to end up going 20 miles before we run out of energy. And that, of course, means that when we pass the 10-mile mark, whereas our 1 by 1 by 1 cube has lost all its forward momentum and is at 0 forward speed, our 2 by 2 by 2 is still going to be going at half its initial speed. And that obviously means that tracing further back, at say 5 miles, it's going to be going faster than the 1 by 1 by 1 because it's retained more energy. Now, of course, you could try and increase that efficiency by making, in this case, our 2 by 2 by 2, you could make it a 2 by 1 by 4 and have it fly with its 2 by 1 facing forward. Again, just a way of illustrating how you can change the frontal cross-sectional area. But it's far more to do with the total amount of mass, because the air resistance per unit area is going to remain roughly the same, but the overall amount of energy you have because of that mass is going to be the thing that's changing dramatically, not so much the length. With the second element of the question, if you double the charge in a gun, there's 2 main factors in play. There's a lot of other factors as well, but the 2 main, I guess, simplest to explain ones are that if you double the charge, you're not doubling the charge, doubling the explosive power, and doubling the surface area of the barrel that's absorbing the blast. Because again, if you consider cubes, a 1 by 1 by 1 cube, so if our 1 by 1 by 1 cube is a 10-pound charge, let's say, then you obviously have 6 sides to your cube. So one side is facing the breech, one side is facing the shell, and 4 sides are facing our presumably square cross-section barrel, which means that in terms of direct forces, you have 2/3 of the explosive force being directed at the barrel immediately, and then 1/6 at the breech, 1/6 at the shell. Now, of course, that's not 100% true, because the breech and the shell provide resistance, so there is going to be just overall pressure increasing anyway, and then the shell starts to move and everything starts to change. But again, for a very basic example, it should suffice to illustrate, because as we go to our 20-pound charge, so we now have a 2 by 1 by 1 setup, the face that was previously facing the shell is now covered by the additional charge, and the face on the additional charge that would be facing the breech is also covered. So we still have a breech face and we still have a shell face, but we have 2 additional faces that are now covered and are just part of the explosive. So we now have 10 faces that are facing externally out of 12. But of those 10, 8 of them are facing the barrel directly, and 2 of them aren't, because one's breech, one's shell. And that means that 80% of the external surface of our doubled charge is directly affecting the gun barrel, whereas in the previous example, only 66% was. So we've actually, at a very basic level, proportionally increased the amount of overall explosive power that's being directly inputted into the barrel itself, into the barrel sides, as opposed to the lesser charge. Now, again, as I said, that is a very, very basic example because there's a whole load of other things that go into when you detonate a charge in a barrel, but the basic principle of you double the charge, there's actually more power going into the sides of the barrels is fundamentally accurate. So you're going to get a higher pressure per square inch on the sides of the barrels. Well, and for that matter on the breech and the shell as well, but the shell at least can move. The other thing is just the overall force that is being generated by the explosive going off, because it's not just about surface area, it is about absolute material limits. So again, using a very basic example, if you had a wooden stick that you had tied or weighted or in some way fixed to a table, and there was a bit of it sticking out past the end of a table, and you put a bag, let's say we put a bag of sugar on the end of the stick. So, and the stick survives. Now, that's our, our single charge. Now, if we put 2 bags of sugar on the stick, assuming that they're next to each other, the overall surface area that we are putting this force over has doubled, as has the weight. But the stick might then snap, because it turns out its ultimate breaking point, obviously in this case involving moments of turning and fulcrums, that may have been, say, 1.5 bags of sugar's worth of weight. So the fact that you've put it up to 2, the fact that that's distributed across twice the surface area, hasn't actually changed the fact the stick has broken, because there was an ultimate yield strength involved as well. And it's the same thing with gun barrels. If you put a certain amount of power into them, well, not only, as we discussed already, has the actual pressure per unit area increased somewhat, but also the overall strain that all of that energy collectively is putting into, let's say, where the corner where the barrel turns and becomes the breech face, that has just gone up by quite a large amount, and that may be beyond the tensile yield limit of the gun material, at which point it's going to burst. Sworn brother of the Ballistic Order of St. John Moses Browning asks, I read a while back that before his unfortunate demise at Coronel, Admiral Craddock, then assigned to the Royal Navy's North American station, was involved in the Tampico incident. He seems to have made a good enough impression to be received as a guest of honor by the governor of Texas during a port call in Galveston afterwards. Could you elaborate on his story? What was his involvement, and how well did he interface with the US Navy, both at Tampico and in general, while he was in the West Atlantic? Right, so this is going to require a very quick explanation of what was going on. So the Tampico incident is the immediate catalyst for the occupation of Veracruz in 1914. So what's happened is you have Mexico, which is undergoing a civil war, well, one of many it would have over time. You have its president, Huerta, or General Huerta, who has come to power recently. The US president, Wilson, doesn't like him very much. The feeling is pretty much mutual. And you have the Mexican city of Tampico. Now, to try and manage the safety and security of US citizens, the US Navy is basically doing roughly the same kind of thing that they tried to do in Havana when there were differences of opinion, shall we say, between Cuban insurgents and the Spanish authorities there at the end of the 19th century as to who should be in charge. And that was they'd sent their ships in, except now they had more ships. So you had 2 main formations, one commanded by Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher, the uncle of Frank Jack Fletcher of World War II fame, and another one commanded by Admiral Mayo. And Admiral Mayo's force was off of Tampico. Now, what then happened is rebel groups started advancing on Tampico. So the Mexican officers in charge of the defense of Tampico declared martial law, understandably, and prepared to defend themselves. The British heard about this, and they decided that they were going to try and evacuate some of their citizens from the area because they didn't want them to be caught up in an internal Civil War siege, because those things rarely end well for anyone involved. And so enter Admiral Craddock and the 4th Cruiser Squadron, particularly the protected cruiser HMS Hermione, which was sent directly to Tampico with Admiral Craddock overseeing efforts more generally because there were a few similar situations developing all along the Mexican coast. Into all of this enter the crew of USS Dolphin, a small US auxiliary warship, which had sent a small party in a boat ashore to acquire some petrol. Now, there was something of a misunderstanding because the city was under martial law, which meant you couldn't just rock up at the dockside and start acquiring goods. However, what should have happened is guards spotting this boat coming in should have said, no, hang on, sorry, port is closed, martial law, unless you've got a prior appointment, go away. And that would have pretty much been the end of it. But due to some communication breakdowns, obviously Dolphin not telling anyone that they were sending men in, and people in and the guards in the town not necessarily strictly understanding what they could and couldn't do, they arrested the US sailors who had gone ashore and then threatened those in the ship's boat that they also were going to come ashore at rifle point. These were then taken up, and the overall commander in the town went, yeah, you shouldn't have done that. Go back to the dock. I'm going to try and sort this out. He tried to sort it out. He said, okay, right, we're going to let them go because that shouldn't have happened. And he sent the men back after obviously a few hours of being detained with apologies. Now, in theory, that should have been the end of it because, yes, you had US sailors who had been threatened with firearms, but it was largely as a result of a miscommunication and no one had actually been hurt. So theoretically, apologies should have done it. However, Admiral Mayo decided that this was not good enough, and therefore he's sent back a reply which essentially said, okay, I want full apologies, disavow the action. I also want the officer who did this, who arrested my men, punished, and I want you to raise the US flag in your town and give it a salute. The first two, the Mexicans seem to have been relatively willing to go along with. The last one, hoisting a foreign country's flag over your town, which is currently under martial law, need I stress, and then giving it a gun salute, that they felt was a step too far, both generally and for their honour particularly. That then was all fed back to Wilson, who, as we said, we didn't particularly like Huerta, so he backed Mayo. Fletcher kind of thought, well, hang on a minute, well, you're blowing this really out of proportion, but Wilson had basically gone, now this is an opportunity to hammer Huerta and get a one-up on him. And then in the middle of all this, you have the Royal Navy, who, as we said, have shown up slightly earlier to try and sort out potential evacuation for British citizens who might be under threat if the city comes under siege from Mexican rebels, except now they've got to deal with not only that situation, but the possibility that the US Navy is going to start shooting at the town. And Mayo and Wilson don't seem to have factored in that there are actually quite a number of US citizens in Tampico as well, who you would be shelling if you do a general bombardment of the town when the Mexicans, for obvious reasons, to say, no, we're not going to salute your flag on our own soil just because you asked us to. So while this whole situation is escalating, Craddock orders Hermione to start looking after what have essentially now become refugees, the foreign residents in Tampico, plus some Mexicans who weren't too keen to be shot at from both sides either. And when it becomes clear that the combined British, American, and Mexican refugees are too much for the Hermione on her own to handle, then they also get the SS Antillean, a civilian vessel. They charter it, put a naval party on board and say, right, you're temporarily part of the Royal Navy. Your job is to evacuate people as well. And so while you have a three-way war going on over their heads, the Royal Navy manages to evacuate obviously the British citizens, but also American citizens and concerned Mexicans as well, and keep them safe from the absolute mess that's occurring in Tampico, while simultaneously down the coast there's a slightly less fraught but still ongoing evacuation of other foreign subjects in other Mexican cities that are under similar threat. Now, there were some in the US Navy who really had bought into the Monroe Doctrine and thought, oh, why is the Royal Navy getting involved at all? This is an affair on the continents of the Americas. Only the Americans can get involved. But fortunately, they were very much in the minority. And although it was only 4th Cruiser Squadron, there was, of course, the implicit, don't mess with us, because, if we want to go in and secure the interests of our civilians, we will, and we have the firepower to back it up. But generally, people like Fletcher greatly appreciated the efforts. Obviously, the governor of Texas, because Craddock's forces are helping to evacuate American citizens as well. Essentially, pretty much everybody thinks that Craddock's done a really good job, because he's essentially used the power of the Royal Navy to go in and secure the safety of a large variety of concerned civilians, while everybody else is more interested about shooting at each other. And I guess to sum up what the US, most of the people in the US thought about it, by the time the incident had mostly blown over, at least as far as the active shooting was concerned, the Commander-in-Chief of the US Atlantic Fleet wrote, he said, Rear Admiral Craddock and the commanding officers of the British ships Hermione at Tampico and Berwick at Puerto Mexico have been untiring in their efforts to collect and forward American citizens to refugee ships, and that continuation of these kindly efforts is still being made, because obviously, ongoing civil war on land. These services have been of great value and deserve the grateful thanks of this government. I have accordingly instructed the American ambassador at London to make known to His Majesty's government this government's gratitude for and appreciation of the generous and friendly conduct of these British officers. Kra F1 asks, during the Battle of Samar, the Japanese fleet famously misidentified the escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy 3 as fleet carriers and cruisers, respectively. During the battle, the US destroyers and destroyer escorts made several torpedo attacks on the Japanese ships. Given that most US cruisers did not carry torpedoes, wouldn't these attacks have given away the US ships as destroyers? What was the Japanese Navy's knowledge of US Navy cruiser torpedo armament before and during the war? You'd think so. And eventually one or two Japanese ships did begin to realize that we're shooting at destroyers, usually once you get close enough to do a full-on visual identification, but it took a lot longer than you might otherwise expect. Because the thing is, the destroyers and destroyer escorts, just in and of themselves launching torpedoes, didn't necessarily tell the Japanese, hey, these aren't US cruisers. As you say, most US cruisers didn't have torpedoes, but some did. The Atlanta class, for instance, had torpedo launchers, and if you're unsure as to the identity of a ship, but it's rapid firing lots of shells at you, then thinking that perhaps it might be an Atlanta class, obviously assuming you don't have a particularly good visual spot on it, might be forgivable, because, well, at the rate that Johnston, Howell, Roberts, etc. were pumping out shells, they definitely weren't 8-inch cruisers, and probably not even 6-inch, because, well, the 6-inch ships would have had very, very distinctive profiles. So they might have concluded they were Atlanta class. Another thing to take into account, gunfire rates of fire aside, is that some of the earliest US cruisers of the time period, so Omahas and the Pensacola's, at least initially, were fitted with torpedo launchers. So as far as the Japanese reasoning went, it could have been that these were perhaps older US ships that had their torpedo launchers. Now, yes, the Pensacola's did land their torpedo launchers before the outbreak of the Second World War, but whether or not the Japanese were aware of this, and of course, later US heavy cruisers were not designed with torpedo launchers in the first place upon completion, but the fact was that everybody else's cruisers had torpedo launchers. Some of the earlier US cruisers had torpedo launchers. And given that the Japanese were kind of the greatest example in the interwar period of fitting ships for but not with stuff to try and get around treaties, honestly, if I was a Japanese officer in the middle of World War II, I would be far more likely to conclude that, whereas Japan might have lied about a few things to claim that their ships were under the 10,000-ton limit, I could also quite equally believe that the US had gone, okay, well, we're going to claim we're not installing torpedoes and torpedo launchers and thus take their weight off of our displacement limit calculations to come in under 10,000 tons. But as soon as war comes about, well, obviously they're going to add torpedo launchers straight back into where they clearly plan to have them in the first place. even assuming that they didn't think that Johnston was an Omaha class or something like that. So just the fact that there were US destroyers firing torpedoes at them wasn't going to necessarily clue in a Japanese ship that maybe doesn't have a particularly good visual spot on them that these are in fact destroyers when they think they're cruisers, because there's plenty of reasons why they would think that there could be US cruisers with torpedo launchers present in the battle, at least until you get a very clear view of the ship in question. Hugh Fisher asks, what navy would you prefer to serve on, or maybe your top 3 navies, historically, based solely on the preferred drinks served aboard their warships, rum, beer, wine, etc.? Well, for the period covered by the channel, essentially if we're going to go purely by the alcohol they serve on board, the further north you go, the more likely I am going to want to be serving on those ships. Because personally, I am much more into strong spirits than I am weaker stuff. So wine, I mean, I like some kinds of wine, but the kind of wine that was served in relatively large quantities on a lot of Mediterranean Navy ships and so forth, as in Italy, Spain, France, etc., that's all red wine. And I don't like the vast majority of red wines because they're far too strong in tannins, and I hate the taste of tannins. So, yeah, forget that. But then as you move further north, you start to get into things like rum and various other stronger spirits, and beer as well. But as I said, I have a preference for the stronger alcohols over the weaker. So the further north you go, the less and less beer you'll find, and the more and more rum, vodka, and various other associated double-digit percentage alcohol content liquids are stored aboard. And so, yeah, that's where I'm heading, basically. Jim Smitty asks, assuming the following: firstly, the challenges of working with titanium are overcome in the mid to late 1920s, and secondly, cost is not an issue. With these assumptions in place, how much weight could be saved if titanium was used to replace structural steel of warships in the 1930s and 40s? Would this be a meaningful amount of weight saved that people could place into more armament, armour or engine power? Or would the save weight have been minor and have more negative effects on the ship's buoyancy and stability? Or would there be some mix of the two, or other factors I'm not seeing? Okay, so I'm going to address this from 2 perspectives. Firstly, in absolute terms, as presented in the question, if you replace all the structural steel in a warship with titanium, is this going to save a meaningful amount of weight? Well, yeah, that is going to give you a huge amount of weight that you could put towards all sorts of other fun things. So, for example, the King George V class, the hull weight is just over 13,000 tons out of a 35,000 ton design. Then, of course, you've got armour, armament, equipment, all these other weights that add up. But just the basic shell of the boat or ship in this case is about 13,000 tons. Now, that is going to shift very slightly depending on which battleship you're looking at in the 35,000 ton treaty category, but not by a huge amount. And overall, titanium is generally held to save you about 40% of the weight as compared to steel. So in the case of your average treaty battleship, that's going to save you about 5,000 to 6,000 tons. That's a lot of weight. 5,000 to 6,000 tons, you could massively up-armour the ship. You could include additional guns. You could include more armour and more guns and more machinery. You could do a huge amount with that. I mean, taking the King George V class for an example, with that amount of spare weight left over, you could probably have included enough machinery to bump the King George V up to about 30 knots, and given it a uniform 16-inch thick belt, and given it its 4 quadruple 14-inch turrets, and probably stuck on a bunch of additional anti-aircraft guns for good measure, and you'd probably still have some weight left over. So, yeah, that's a lot. However, the secondary issue, or the second way I'm going to address this, is that you couldn't just make a battleship's hull and structural elements out of titanium, even putting aside cost and working with it. simply because some of the material properties of titanium versus steel, particularly when it comes to ductility, because titanium does have a lot of advantage over steel, even in a marine environment. Apart from the obvious weight-saving issue, it is also incredibly corrosion resistant, so it's not going to rust anywhere near as much as steel. Well, it technically can't rust because it's not going to have iron oxide on it, but it's not going to corrode anywhere near as much as steel. Which you might think, that's actually a really good advantage, and yeah, technically is. The big problem is that ductility, though. Ships need to flex, and they need to bend in the sea, and even having a certain degree of ductility is very useful when it comes to absorbing battle damage, because steel that tears is better than steel that fragments, and steel that rips is better than steel that cracks, and so on and so forth. So if you made, say, a battleship's hull plating out of titanium, yes, you'd save a bunch of weight, and yes, it's not going to rust. But if you look at the amount of dishing and bashing and twisting that battleship hull plates take over the years, it's much, much more likely that a titanium plate will crack, which is obviously suboptimal. Now, of course, there are various titanium alloys that can reduce that to a certain degree, but overall, good quality structural steel is still going to be somewhat more flexible than titanium. So in the scenario that you posit, I think there would be some more modest savings, because titanium would still be very useful in, say, doing the superstructure, much as aluminium would be used for similar reasons in Cold War era ships. Save a lot of weight on the superstructure, that saves top weight, thus improves stability quite dramatically, and saves weight overall. So yes, easily workable, relatively cheap titanium would definitely be used in ships, and it would save enough displacement to allow it to increase armor, firepower, protection, etc. But on, say, a 35,000-ton ship, I think you'd probably be looking at savings more in the order of high hundreds to low thousands of tons, which is still a lot. You can still vastly improve a ship with that, but it's not going to be the sort of 5,000-6,000 plus tons of doing the entire structure in titanium. Ian Carr asks, how much at risk were battleships allocated to support World War II Atlantic convoys, particularly at night from U-boats on the surface? None were lost or, to my knowledge, damaged. Was their location in a convoy consistent? And who commanded the convoy? There certainly was some risk. For example, the battleship Malaya was torpedoed while on convoy escort duty by a submarine that was trying to get at the convoy. It was actually the convoy immediately after the one that she was in where she scared off the two Scharnhorsts, and this photo is of her departing New York after repairs for said torpedo damage. So they were occasionally torpedoed, and in fact SL-67, the convoy where the Scharnhorsts came upon Malaya escorting at the convoy, the Scharnhorst had actually hoped that the U-boats might be able to put Malaya down so that they could move in and attack. But obviously that didn't happen. Now, when it comes to their location and who commanded the convoy, the location was not consistent. So it wasn't a case of, right, this battleship sails in this position relative to the convoy at all times. When you were putting something as valuable as a battleship or a battlecruiser or a full fleet carrier on escort duty for a convoy, they would sail close to the convoy, but they weren't sailing in a strict formation as part of the convoy the way that a destroyer or a corvette might sail. Instead, they were near the convoy. They would have their own escorts of destroyers, etc., and they would move around as they saw fit, both to throw off enemy submarines, to allow the convoy's close escorts to go and prosecute submarine contacts without getting in the way. And of course, this was also necessary because if a big capital ship threat came over the horizon and the battleship needed to maneuver to fight it, that was obviously going to happen somewhat independent of where the convoy was going. So of necessity, the battleships had to be adjacent to but not strictly part of the convoy, because otherwise the battleship leaving to fight an enemy capital ship would leave a socking great hole in the convoy's coverage through which other things could stream. And thus command could go, depending on the convoy in question and the time period, either 2 ways or 3 ways. So you would have an actual convoy commander who was in charge of wrangling all the merchant ships. So that was always a position. Then you would have the naval commander of the naval escort. Now, this is where it could go one of two ways, because either, especially in the early part of the war, the battleship and its attendant escort may also be, collectively the convoy escort. So some of the destroyers or whatever assigned to the battleship may also be forming the actual convoy escort itself, in which case usually the senior officer aboard the battleship is also going to be the military escort part of the convoy's commander. But as time goes on and more escorts are available, you would end up with there being a convoy escort commander. So someone like Johnny Walker, for example, in command of sloops, frigates, corvettes, small destroyers, etc., etc. And then your nearby battleship and its fleet destroyers would come under a separate command structure, although obviously there would be a level of seniority, but there were very different roles and responsibilities. And the ultimate expression of that you'd see on places like the Arctic convoys, where you had the convoy with the convoy commander, the close escort with the escort commander, and then the distant cover force with battleships and carriers and cruisers, and they had their own commander as well. Ran Parr asks, as far as I know, the first use of a hollow charge was by the Germans in Belgium in 1940. Why didn't navies in World War II adopt the technology, and how might some famous battles such as Samar, Narvik and others have looked if they had? The simple answer is much less spectacular, much less effective. It's not a good idea for you to use hollow charge munitions for the most part in naval actions in the Second World War. And that's because a hollow charge is a shaped charge, aka a high explosive anti-tank shell, heat round, something we've discussed a few times before on the channel, but just to reiterate, essentially, in very basic terms, the way such a charge works is by shaping a very narrow slug, usually of copper, that acts like a liquid, even if it is not necessarily immediately itself a liquid, and then that gets punched through at great velocity, whatever armor protection happens to be standing in the way. This is obviously very effective against tanks, for the most part, unless you get modern exotic composite armors. The problem when it comes to using this technology against ships is simply that its damage radius and depth is nowhere near large enough. So such a charge has to explode on contact. So an armor-piercing shell, which is your primary damage dealer against most ships, goes deep into your target, and then it explodes. So you're reaching close to the vitals, whether that be the machinery spaces, the magazines, or something else equally useful. And then when it explodes, you get a shockwave from the blast in all directions, you get shrapnel in all directions, and you get a cone of very heavy fragments, which mostly are heading forward, but still somewhat in all directions. And obviously that's kinetic energy and still a lot of heat. So the overall radius of effect of the shell exploding is not only starting deep in the ship, hopefully, but also encompassing a relatively large volume. Whereas with a hollow charge, shaped charge, heat round, whatever you want to call it, that's detonating on the exterior of the ship. Now, yes, a 5-inch, 6-inch, 8-inch, 15-inch, 16-inch charge is going to have insane levels of penetration, so armor's not going to stop it for the most part, but you're going to get a very narrow jet emerging through the armor into the hollow space of the outer compartments of a warship. And in most cases, except against very small, lightly built warships like destroyers, that's not going to be a vital space by any stretch of the imagination. And then that jet is going to meet, obviously, air resistance. It's going to start to slow down. It's going to start to flare out. It's basically going to lose its penetrative power. Then it's going to encounter bulkheads. And then the same thing's going to happen. So it's coming out with less energy. Then it's losing even more power. It may encounter some form of armored deck, depending on where it has hit and what the armor layout of the ship in question is. And essentially, it's just going to very quickly lose coherency and energy. And thus, although in absolute terms, if you looked at the theoretical armor piercing capability of a 16-inch hollow charge round, that might suggest that you have more than enough penetration to go through the armor, through the hull plating, through any arbitrary number of bulkheads and then hit, let's say, a magazine. The simple fact is that because essentially what you're firing at is a 35,000+ ton box of spaced armor, it's not actually going to get anywhere close to that level of penetration, and it's probably going to dissipate far, far, far before it reaches anything particularly vital. The other problem, of course, is that, as I said, an armor-piercing shell has an explosive radius. So even if you don't necessarily directly hit the magazines or directly hit the machinery spaces, detonating close by may be enough to get hot fragments of metal into those vital spaces and cause a lot of damage. And the shockwave can rupture pipelines and so forth. Whereas with a shaped charge, even if we're talking about smaller ships, you have a very narrow jet. And of course, on a tank, that doesn't matter quite so much, because on a tank, you've got a very small enclosed environment, which is going to heat up very rapidly and spatter, and scattering and ricochets are going to completely total the tanker, even if the heat doesn't get you. But on big open expanses of volume like a ship, that's the overall effect is going to be much, much, much less. And if, let's say, you fired a shell that, if you follow a course through the ship, would have gone within, let's say, 6 feet of a magazine. With an armor-piercing shell, if it goes within 6 feet of a magazine and detonates, it's got one bulkhead to go through. There's a good chance you're going to set the magazine off, or at least start a magazine fire. If your hollow charge, stream of copper or whatever goes within 6 feet of a magazine, the magazine's perfectly fine. It's just passed by. And yes, there'll be a small hole in the ship, but that's damage control can easily fix that. And ultimately, even against smaller ships, like, say, destroyers, where, a heat round hitting the side of the ship amidships 4 feet above the waterline might very well actually send a jet of copper into the engine room. Again, that, given the overall volumes involved in being in an engine room, there is a statistically relatively decent chance that your hot jet of copper might just go straight through the engine room and out the other side without actually touching anything vital. You're going to raise the ambient temperature inside a little bit, and there'll be some sprays of hot scatter, but you might not actually do anything other than people going, there's a hole where there wasn't a hole before. Whereas if you hit that same point on the hull with a high explosive round, because that's what you tend to want to use against destroyers, or a high capacity round if you're American, then suddenly you have a big explosion and lots of hot fragments and fire and all sorts of things flying in, and they're much more likely to hit something nasty on their way through. Or to put it in very simple terms, imagine you have a can of beans. What does more damage if you poke a strong needle, or stab a very strong needle or a stiletto dagger through said can of beans, or you put that can of beans on the floor and you hit it with a sledgehammer? You're going to get a lot less penetration with the sledgehammer, but it's going to do a heck of a lot more damage to the overall can. Elite Corsair asks, lots of commanders in the Guadalcanal and Solomons campaigns and the associated naval actions seem to practice extreme radio silence, and it seems to have been more harmful than helpful in many battles. At what point does radio silence become more harmful than helpful for a commander in these circumstances, and was anything learned in this regard for future battles during and after the Solomons campaign? I think when radio silence becomes more harmful than helpful in that context depends largely on three things. Firstly, have you made a clear and coherent battle plan that your commanders are aware of? If you have a very clear plan, then you don't need as much radio communication. If you don't have much of a clear battle plan, and essentially the rest of your fleet is sailing blind, then extreme radio silence is more harmful, because you're essentially sending ships in with no idea of what they're supposed to do other than shoot vaguely in the direction of the enemy. But who is the enemy at that point? Where are they? How many of them are there? They don't know any of this. This is how you get friendly fire, amongst other things. The second issue is, how well equipped are your ships for night action? So the Japanese, in theory, are somewhat better placed for extreme radio silence because they have a lot of low light essentially, we might call it night vision equipment, as well as a lot of training and doctrine for fighting at night. Whereas US ships at this stage didn't really have that much of a night fighting doctrine, and some ships had fairly decent radar for the time, giving them a degree of compensation for that. Some ships had the earlier forms of radar, which weren't quite as good, maybe not quite as wide an arc, not quite as high sensitivity, not quite as long a range, and some ships didn't have radar at all. And, well, in those circumstances, you really need the ships that can see stuff to be able to tell the ships that can't see stuff what's going on. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to get on the radio and go, hey, everyone, I've seen a Japanese ship, it's over here, blah, 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 blah. You could come up with a radio code, if you like, and I'm not talking about encryption or scrambling or anything like that, just simply something like designated numbers and letters that mean stuff. So instead of having to pick up a voice radio and go blah 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 for 30 seconds or so, which people can fairly easily pick up and triangulate, you could have essentially just a burst transmission that would be something like let's say 2D 340, which would mean 2 enemy destroyers at 340 degrees, so 20 degrees to the west of true north, or magnetic north, at which point, if everyone knows what this code means, you can send out short, low-power burst transmissions, which are relatively unlikely to be picked up and relatively unlikely to be deciphered, which can then give your fleet a lot more information than they might otherwise have. And that kind of ties into the third issue of exactly what kind of transmissions are you making? You know, are you making very loud general broadcasts that are going on for quite some time? Because that's going to enable radio direction finding to point out exactly where you are and possibly even work out what you're saying through interception very easily. Or are you, because you know that all your ships are within, say, I don't know, let's say you know that all your ships are within a 6,000 yard radius of your own ship. Therefore, if you lower the output of your radio system, if you indeed can do that, to a point that, say, even if an enemy ship is twice as far away, let's say, if you know everyone's 5,000 yards away, for example, configure your radio system so that essentially the transmission is going to be too weak to pick up at 10 to 12,000 yards. So it's going to be more than strong enough for your ships to pick up, but unless your enemy is within that 10 to 12,000 yard radius, they shouldn't be able to hear you anyway. And again, keep your transmissions short, sharp, and to the point, and you could, in theory, have radio communication without having much risk of being picked up by the enemy. And of course, you could dial the power down even more, although at that point you are risking your own ships potentially not hearing you. But you could perhaps have standing instructions to dial your radios down really low, and then have each ship relay what it has been told to the ship ahead or behind it. And that way you could have a really close-knit brief radio communication. And then if your opponent picks up those transmissions, well, they're probably far too close for comfort anyway. DM Phoenix asks, what is your opinion on deploying warships for but not with their full armament or equipment? Is it a smart cost-saving measure that also future-proofs ships against new and upcoming technology, or is it a dangerous risk having underarmed, undercapable ships in the short term? And would you say that the Megamis, and where would you say the Megamis and Scharnhorst fall in this policy? I think I would say it depends on exactly how you do it. So, have you got a ship that is very capable and well spec'd, and then you've taken an element of it out purely to save costs in the short term? That is a bad idea, because whoever designed the ship has probably designed it to be capable with that full range of equipment, and then you've removed it, so your ship is now less capable than it should be. And ultimately, the very, very long history of ship design and, well, equipment design as a whole proves that for but not with usually ends up being slightly more expensive, and at the minimum, and potentially a lot more expensive. It's just the costs are slightly spread out over time. So if you're looking to net save money, fitting for but not with is not usually the best idea in those design circumstances, obviously. But if you're designing a ship that is pretty capable, is a decent frontline combatant in and of itself, no massive glaring weaknesses, but happens to be capable of also having a bunch of extra stuff added to it, then it can be a good idea. Because, well, as I said, you have a capable combat asset, you just have the capability to either make it more combat capable or change its combat capabilities going forward. Another element is, what systems are you planning on putting into it later on, and why are you doing this in the first place? Because if, let's say, for sake of argument, you are planning a for but not with scheme because there's some kind of treaty and you want to get under the tonnage limitations of that treaty, then that's a lot more understandable and forgivable, assuming that you've designed the ship to then be able to very quickly accept that change, than if you're kind of, finger in the wind, well, maybe if we do this, we'll save a little bit of money now, and there's some nebulous thing we may or may not put into it later, but we don't know what it is. That's not a good way of going about things at all. So a good way of doing for but not with might be that ideally you want this ship, let's say we're using an interwar period concept, you might want the ship to have twin dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns, so twin 4-inch, twin 5-inch 38, something like that. But let's say there's a production bottleneck that means that those ships can't have them just yet. So at that point, put in the base mountings that can support the twin guns, but maybe only put singles in because you have lots of singles lying around. You have a degree of anti-aircraft defense, but it's fitted for but not with the clear and specific intention. Like, you have those twin gun systems on order, but they're only going to be ready 6 months, 12 months, 18 months after the ship is commissioned, maybe a couple of years. Fine, get the ship out there. That saves money because you're building it on time and on schedule. You have the ship. Yes, it's got slightly less anti-aircraft defense than you'd want, but then you have definite plans to put the new stuff in, and it's already been designed to accept it. So yeah, you can do it well or you can do it badly. Unfortunately, historically, and even up to the present day, most for but not withs have been done badly, either because it turns out they've been done very vaguely and you need a huge amount of additional cost to actually fit the thing that theoretically it can accept, or it's been done as kind of a budget sop, and then the person who's cut the budget in the first place refuses to pay for any of the upgrades later on, and you end up with just a permanently under-equipped vessel. And as far as the Megamis and Scharnhorst are concerned, I would say the Megamis fall in absolute terms more towards the done properly side of things, because they were designed pretty much from the start to be heavy cruisers with twin 8-inch guns, and the swap over from 666 to twin 8 was fairly quick, fairly easy. Equipment was available and had, relatively speaking, minimal issues. The Scharnhorsts, on a sliding scale, I would say probably fall a little bit more towards the side of not being that well executed, because yes, they had space for lifting out 1111s and putting in twin 15s, which is, overall a net good thing from a design perspective. However, it turns out that you would also need a socking great bow extension stuck on it in order to increase the buoyancy. Now, I'm a little bit on the fence with that one, because part of the reason they needed that bow extension was because it turns out they screwed up the designs of the Scharnhorst a little bit anyway. So obviously the straight stem definitely didn't work, and even the Atlantic bow didn't solve the problems entirely. They were nose-heavy designs, period. So if they'd been much better designed seakeeping-wise, much more longitudinally stable, then, well, you probably still would have needed to do some work to the bows to accommodate the twin 15s, but perhaps not to quite the extent that they were going to have to do with Gneisenau. So that, you could argue some of that is actually just a general fault with the design of the ships as a whole, rather than the for but not with element of it. But even so, where you have to start making substantial changes to the overall ship to fit the thing you're supposedly doing for but not with, I'd say at that point you probably should have just thought about doing it from the start. The Outer Circle asks, if ships in the Age of Sail utilised an extensive amount of their powder and shot during battle, What effect did this, in conjunction with battle damage, have on their stability and ballast? With so much weight from down low moving up high and then outwards with some rapidity, surely this had an impact and potentially led to ship losses? I could see it potentially having a small impact in really dire situations, but overall, a large ship of the line is going to be carrying, if you add together all the powder and all the shot, it's going to be carrying around about 110 to 150 tons worth of ammunition. That's for something like, maybe a 74, maybe carry 80 to 110 tons. And then as you go up through the 80 gunners, the 92 gunners, the 98 gunners, up to something like Victory, 104 guns, then eventually with a 104, 110 gun ship of the line, you're probably pushing 150 tons. If you've got one of the big 120 gunners or more, then you might carry a bit more than that. But so let's say, for the sake of argument, about 120 tons for a decent-sized ship of the line. So for a ship like Victory, that would be between 4 and 5% of the ship's overall displacement. Now, you might be thinking, well, yeah, move 4 or 5% of the ship's displacement up and out of the ship, and that could cause some issues. But you've got to bear in mind that the ship's crew and their personal effects probably weighed about as much. If you allow about 150 kilos for each crewman and all their personal effects, hammock, sea chest, etc., then actually the ship's complement weighs about as much as the ship's full ammunition load. And the ship's actual guns, just the guns themselves, not counting the weight of the carriages and the ropes and everything, just the gun barrels, that is going to weigh 2.5, maybe 3 times as much as the ammunition. So when you bear in mind that when the ship goes into ordinary, they still remain relatively stable. When they're in refit, it's still relatively stable, even with the crew, or the good majority of the crew, and the armament stripped out. Well, then suddenly it doesn't seem quite so bad, does it? And I mean, another way of looking at it would be if you look at the draft. So for HMS Victory, her draft is just a fraction under 30 feet, which, if you use a very crude calculation, would suggest that for every 120 to 130 tons of displacement, Victory sits in the water by about a foot. Now, of course, that's very rough and ready. That's not actually how it would work in reality, because apart from anything else, Victory's underwater hull is not a uniform shape all the way down. So obviously the upper portions, the shallower portions of the ship's hull are going to be displacing significantly more. Let's say the first 5 feet of her hull underwater will be displacing significantly more than the absolute lowest portion of the ship, because obviously that doesn't have a huge amount of volume to it. But that means if we say that 120 to 130 tons of displacement is worth about a foot of draft, we're actually being incredibly conservative in favor of the ship becoming unstable. But then you realize, well, even if you fired off every single ounce of powder and every single cannon shot on board, the ship is basically then going to be going up by about a foot. And in reality, considerably less than that. So in actual fact, all things considered, shooting through your entire stock of powder and shot in the Age of Sail, at least for the Napoleonic era, isn't going to have a huge amount of effect on your stability or ballasting. And the fact that you're sitting slightly higher in the water is obviously going to help slightly with damage control. The only time it could have an absolutely marginal effect, but something that could still be fatal, would be perhaps if your ship has been very heavily holed at or near the waterline, and you now have more of your ship just as a linear measurement above the waterline. And if you're sloshing back and forth, you've got free surface effect, you've got wind maybe cutting crossways across you, pulling on your sails and masts, then maybe there would be a certain angle where if you had a cargo hold full of and a magazine full of powder and shot, maybe you would just about recover from that particular roll, and maybe in this circumstance, you maybe just about don't, and then you roll over on your side and sink. But it'd be a very niche area where that could happen. Daniel Silverthorne asks, there's a video which discusses the US Army Air Corps use of aerial mine warfare against Japan. What other efforts were made beyond aerial mines by the USAAC and submarine patrols to subdue Japanese shipping? Additionally, how did these aerial mines differ from ship or submarine-based mines? And also, how does one acquire one of your HMS Thunderchild models? So there were a number of other efforts to get rid of Japanese ships. There were surface patrols on occasion, everything from PT boats to destroyers to cruisers, although obviously that was in the later stages of the war. You had the occasional early war level bombing attempts. Obviously those weren't particularly successful. Later on in the war, you had direct assault by aircraft, including skip bombing. This is probably one of the most famous photos of the Pacific War, an American medium bomber conducting an attack run on a Japanese freighter. So you have direct aerial assault on Japanese merchant shipping by the US Army Air Corps. You have the US Navy doing the same thing with its carrier-based aircraft as and when they can, and both the US Air Corps, Air Force, and the US Navy are hitting Japanese shipping when it's in harbour as well, when they're attacking Japanese strongholds, Japanese port facilities, etc. They're going after ships. Well, while they're at anchor, they are much easier targets after all. There's also a small number of Special Forces commando raids. When I covered MV Crate, I detailed one particularly daring mission to try and get rid of Japanese shipping while it was in Singapore harbour. And to a certain degree, you can even expand that definition to include strikes against key infrastructure, either resource production or refinement and manufacturing infrastructure or port infrastructure, because although you're not going after the ships themselves, if the ships don't have anything to carry, then they're effectively paralyzed, waiting for something to be produced for them to haul around. And, I mean, to a certain extent, even going after things like tankers is also going after Japanese merchant shipping in general, because although obviously the oil is mostly being used for the Japanese Navy, there are a good number of Japanese merchant ships that are still using oil. Or if you go after colliers for the older ships, going after ships that are supplying the fuel for the rest of the Japanese merchant fleet will also tend to paralyze Japanese merchant capabilities. Now, as far as aerial mines go, for the most part, US aerial mines resemble cylinders, relatively short, stubby cylinders, sometimes with a vaguely hemispherical nose, sometimes with just a flat nose, and some form of guidance fin or tail surface on the back. So essentially, if you imagine one of the big demolition bombs that you'd see used in World War II, they look kind of like that. And in fact, some of them were even used as demolition bombs. So another way of sort of thinking about it would be a very sort of baby's first attempt to draw a bomb or a very short torpedo, something like that. Obviously, though, without propulsion systems. They also didn't have the weights, anchors, and chain system that a full mine would have, a mine launched from a ship or a submarine. So they could only be used in relatively shallow water because they'd go down to the seabed and sit there waiting for something to pass over before they explode. The other restriction with this kind of mine is that the vast majority, so Mark 13 mines, Mark 15 mines, that kind of thing, were about half the weight of a ship or submarine deployed mine. So most of the US aerial mines were around 1,000 pounds, or maybe just a little bit over that, with between a third and to just over half of their weight being explosive, whereas the submarine and ship-launched mines tend to be a little bit over 2,000 pounds, with a roughly similar ratio, edging towards the higher end being explosive, which would generally mean that the ship and sub-launched mines would have 2 to 3 times the explosive power of the aerial mines. That did change, however, with the Mark 25 aerial mine, which was introduced later on in the war, which was roughly the same weight and had roughly the same explosive power as ship and sub-launched mines. But for obvious reasons, that was the kind of thing that the B-29 would carry, because there's a lot of weight. As far as getting a hold of one of my Thunderchild models in a physical form, I'm still experimenting. So basically, if you'd like a 3D print of HMS Thunderchild, then get in contact with me via email, and I can see about sorting you out one. Obviously, there will be postage and a small materials cost to pay. But I can print in, I think it's 1:700 scale in resin, in a very small amount. Obviously, I am one guy with one resin 3D printer. I cannot mass produce these things, but I can produce a small number of them. The only caveat with the 1:700 model, which comes out about 5 to 6 inches long, is that the secondary guns, the 6-inch guns, and depending on how lucky I am with the print, sometimes the mast, they are really, really thin at that scale, which can make snapping a little bit of a problem. So if you're happy for me to print something at that scale without the 6-inch guns, so you'll still get the casemates and everything, but the actual gun barrels won't be there, because then you'd be putting them in with some brass rod or carbon fiber rod of your own, then I can do it at that scale. But as the other thing which I'm experimenting with is printing the hull at a 2x scale for the STL on a standard filament 3D printer, since I've got one that can do some pretty good settings. And if I can perfect that, then all the other stuff, guns, turrets, funnels, superstructure, that all drops on top, all of that can then obviously be done in resin to get the high res, the accuracy, etc. And then you get a much larger scale model, which would obviously be quite nice. It'd be sort of about 1 foot long. And you can then, or maybe a little bit less, probably about 10 inches. And then you can also get the gun barrels, etc. sent through as well, because they'll be big enough to not snap the minute I try and take them off the build plate. But as and when I've tweaked all the settings and I'm happy with being able to produce them to a limited degree, then I will probably do a small batch run, and maybe I'll put some like pre-orders or limited run pre-orders or something up. Because I have a feeling if everybody deluges me with requests, I'll basically just be doing 3D prints till like the middle of next year. Coneled asks, during the Grant administration, there was some consideration given to annexing territory in the Caribbean. How do you think it would have turned out for the US? And if the US had more concrete interests, i.e. one or more new states in that territory, how do you think it would have impacted naval development during the ironclad era through to World War I? Well, it depends what extent of territorial annexation or expansion the US tries to attempt, because you have historically Grant's attempt to annex what we now call the Dominican Republic, which came within a hair's breadth of actually succeeding. Now, that, obviously, it would only take 1 or 2 votes changing for that to actually have occurred, and that annexation was supposed to have a direct path through to the Dominican Republic eventually becoming a state within the United States, which, I mean, obviously that politics, especially politics on that side of the pond, is not really something I study to any great degree, but given the, shall we say, somewhat troubled history of the Dominican Republic, what with people constantly trying to invade and butcher them all, there's certainly some argument to say that if they had become part of the United States, they would at least benefit from the protection of the rest of the United States. So maybe they wouldn't have been quite as regularly brutalized by some of their neighbors. On the other hand, we are talking about an immediate post-Civil War United States. So, yeah, there could have been a fair amount of racial discrimination going on there. That is going to happen a lot. Conversely, however, it does mean US interests extend much deeper into the Caribbean. They have interests that are much closer to places like Cuba, which obviously was in that time and for the next few decades after trying to throw off Spanish rule. Various other of the less stable Caribbean and Central American countries. And, of course, they're sitting in the middle of a bunch of European-held countries or islands, obviously Cuba being one, held by Spain, but others held by the Dutch, the French, and the British. Now, if they'd just gone for the Dominican Republic, I don't think it would have made a huge difference for most things, really, in the context of the question you asked. If they then tried to continue expanding, then it would have depended on what are they targeting. Are they targeting islands that are already independent and basically offering to bring them into the fold of the United States? In which case, I think they could get away with a limited amount of increased expansion on those grounds without incurring too many problems from the European powers. But if they go for pretty much all of them, then that could as in all the independent ones, then that could start to cause some eyebrows to be raised, because that would start to involve a fairly large amount of US holdings in the Caribbean. And of course, if they go directly after powers that are held at that point by European powers, then you could actually end up with full-on war in the Caribbean. And when it comes to the effect on the ironclad era through to World War I, again, it depends on how many of these islands are annexed and how the US treats them. Because let's say they annex the Dominican Republic and any other 2 random islands. You could go one of 2 ways. Either the US Navy could turn around and say, all right, okay, look, we've got territory now that we need to defend, and this territory is actually not over an ocean, but at least over a sea, so we do need a few more seagoing heavy assets. At which point, if they manage to shake loose funding for some ironclads in the 1870s, then obviously later ironclads and then into the pre-dreadnought era, the US Navy's infrastructure and industry is going to be slightly better placed for building up in the 1890s and 1900s than it's going to be otherwise. Conversely, the Spanish-American War might be a little bit tougher, because if you do have an oceanic US fleet that is regularly patrolling around in the Caribbean, the Spanish are almost certainly going to, at the very least, apart from anybody else, going to reposition more of their fleet and perhaps even go for a slightly bigger fleet to try and defend their own holdings. The other side of things, of course, would be perhaps taking some of the larger monitors and just going, okay, we're just going to move some of the larger monitors permanently to some of the ports, so kind of like a budget price version of Cerberus and Abyssinia and those other monitors that the British used, in which case it's not going to have a huge overall impact on naval development, because, well, that's a pre-existing known issue. Again, you might see various European powers assigning a few more ships to the Caribbean, but probably not a huge amount else. So I think it really depends on how much extra money will Congress shake loose for the US Navy to defend their new territory. Gunnery Officer asks, how effective was the Mark 27 QT acoustic homing torpedo against chasing enemy escort ships or moving targets? And do you think its combing capabilities are better and more effective than the German T5 Sauerkönig torpedo? Well, the US Navy officially listed the Mark 27 as a defensive weapon, and I think that was a pretty accurate assessment, because ultimately it would be somewhat effective against someone who was coming after you. But comparing it with the Sauerkönig, the T5 German torpedo, specifically that model of German homing torpedo, the German one is just outright a better weapon. So if you're talking about the World War II Mark 27 version, as opposed to the Mod 4, which you can see here, which was a little bit more capable, but still not as capable as a Sauerkönig, the Mark 27 in World War II form, it's only got a top speed of around 12 knots, so it's not catching anything. You know, it's not catching any escort that just turns away from it. It's not even really going to be catching any merchant ships, because yes, there are some merchant ships it's about as fast as, or maybe slightly faster than, but given that that ship is presumably some distance away when you fire it, you'd have to fire it on a converging course and hope it doesn't just try and tail chase for it to actually reach the target before it runs out of power. So, yeah. As a defensive weapon, like you're being chased by a escort, so it's coming towards you and you fire this thing back and it goes after the escort, course correcting on the way, fine. Good way of making your enemy turn away and stop pursuing you. But it's not got a particularly large warhead, and it really is very slow compared to the T5 Sauerkönig, which is 12 knots faster, so about twice as fast. The World War I Mark 27 is about 12 knots. The Sauerkönig is about 24, 25 knots, which means it can actually, even to a limited degree, tail chase corvettes and so forth, and at least match speed with most destroyer escorts, which is going to make evading it much harder. That speed also means it's got a limited degree of capability of actually hunting down and destroying most merchant ships, if you want to use such an expensive weapon on a merchant vessel. But there you go. But you could, which you can't really do with Mark 27. And since the Zaukönig is also a full-size 21-inch torpedo, unsurprisingly, it also carries a much larger warhead, therefore it's much more likely to kill something it hits rather than just damage it. And it seems to be slightly longer range as well than a Mark 27. So, yeah, broadly speaking, the Zaukönig is a superior weapon, but then again, the Mark 27, to say, is a very small, compact, undersized weapon compared to the Zaukönig, so some of that is perhaps not really very surprising. As far as the exact capabilities of the homing, acoustic homing on both torpedoes, that much I don't know in terms of direct comparison. Red Ranger asks, I was playing the Napoleon entry of the Total War series as the Russian Empire when my formation consisting of 8 ships, rather unhelpfully simply called steam paddle frigate, ran across 2 French conventional 74-gun ships of the line. I figured, this'll be easy enough. We're both carrying 32-pound cannon. They have more individually, I have more collectively, and I have the numbers, speed, and manoeuvrability advantage. I'll just send half to cross their T, the other half to cross their stern, dismast them so they can't bring broadsides to bear, and then pummel them till they sink or surrender. I even have the weather gauge so they can't turn and approach me easily. Fast forward a disturbingly short time later, my entire fleet had been ruthlessly executed with nothing to show for it. Have I fundamentally misunderstood Age of Sail combat, or is the difference between a frigate and a ship of the line just too much to bridge? And as a side note, could you take a shot at identifying what ship the steam paddle frigate was modelled after? So your general theory wasn't too bad, but within the scope of the game on what the steam paddle frigate is in the game, I think you ran a cropper. Because although it's called a paddle steam frigate, I think it would be more accurately called a paddle steam carronade frigate, because it has an exceptionally short range. So from the start, you're going to be sailing through a hail of gunfire, and you're not going to be capable of returning fire until you're really, really up close and personal. Another factor is, yeah, it's a frigate. It has a lower hull strength than a ship of the line, and that is going to be a problem for you, as you found out, because you don't need to be hit anywhere near as much in order for you to start losing people, guns, and eventually the hull. And while the steam paddle frigate does reload a little bit faster, it doesn't reload massively faster, and well, it sounds like you didn't get a chance to open fire on your opponents anyway. So essentially what you've experienced is the Trafalgar situation, except that because we're talking about a game, you don't have the weather conditions and the crew morale effects, etc., that the historic Franco-Spanish navies had. And even then, the lead British ships took something of a fearsome pounding, and they were big first rates, being fired on mostly by third rates. Whereas you were in a small frigate hull being fired on by a ship of the line, which was also obviously firing on 2 separate levels with lots of guns. So, yeah, basically they could hit each of your individual hulls with a lot of firepower and take them out one at a time. Also, you had the misfortune of facing the French, because I actually went and did a bit of a dive into the baseline statistics of the various nations' ships, and assuming that we're talking about baseline statistic ships, obviously these ships could have been in service for a while and gained a bunch of experience, but even if they're fresh out of dock, for some reason the Total War developers gave French ships a slightly higher baseline accuracy stat compared to everybody else, so they were probably hitting you with more rounds than would be typical if you were going up against regular 74s. So yeah, you lucked out there, unfortunately. But to be honest, accuracy issues aside, realistically, a bunch of frigates trying to close down a couple of ships of the line head-on I would expect to be picked apart quite easily, as happened to you. They're just much, much more lightly built. Unfortunately, I can't really give you a guess as to what they modelled the steam frigate off of, because this looks less like a steam frigate and more like a 2-deck ship of the line that somebody's taken a cut out of the middle of to stick in the steam engine, which is just bizarre. Personally, if I was commanding that battle, assuming you didn't have any other considerations going, I would have actually had my steam frigates sail into the wind, away from the enemy, and try and therefore force the enemy to turn to tack to come towards me, because then that turns their main broadside battery away from me, at which point I can use my superior maneuverability and speed to just quickly flip around 180 degrees and dive back and get in range of my short-range guns before my opponent can then turn his full broadside to me. Or even if he manages to get a broadside or two off, he might take out one or two of my ships, but then the rest of my ships will be able to essentially execute the tactic you were trying to do earlier of crossing the T. If the gods had wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh Look Mead asks, when and why did the Royal Navy decide that madmen that would willingly choose violence unless explicitly ordered not to would make the best captains for its destroyers? Looking at the way things developed in the Royal Navy, even all the way back to the Age of Sail, I think it was just a natural outgrowth of general Royal Navy policy. Because if you wind back all the way to the Age of Sail, you see the sort of competent but relatively by-the-book officers generally being stuck in ships of the line. You do get the occasional adventurous captain in a 74 or so, but most of the time, although very brave, captains of 74s, again with odd exceptions, tend to be good officers who will follow orders. The really adventurous ones who prove themselves to be, good all-rounders tend to then, even if they are command third rates for a while, they tend to get kicked up to the first rates if there's a good admiral there who wants them as their flag captain or something, or they might be given something like a captured 80 gunner or something like that. Because obviously you need your best officers looking after your most important ships, normally, unless there's a lot of patronage involved. But the more aggressive, more free-spirited, less likely to listen to the strict letter of the law when it comes to orders captains, they tend, unless they do something really spectacular like Nelson, which justifies him staying with the big ships, they tended to get assigned to frigates. So Pellew, Cochrane, so on and so forth. These are frigate men. They are the small ships. They run around doing all sorts of exciting things. Now, of course, with that tradition bedded in throughout the first half of the 19th century, well, there are still frigates in the Royal Navy. Then in the second half, the frigate tends to disappear relatively quickly. But then you have corvettes and sloops and on various colonial missions. So again, there's small ships away from the main capital fleet that you can send your hyper-aggressive captains to as a whole, unless, of course, they prove themselves in large ship command as well. You get people like Fisher for that. And then, of course, that becomes the cruiser, the small cruiser, and some of the faster ones. So again, although you do get a small number of by-the-book officers filtering down into the small ships, and you get a small number of very aggressive officers filtering up into the big ships, generally speaking, there is this kind of sorting going on where the smaller vessels that aren't really going to be part of the main battle fleet, but are going to be relatively autonomous and thus need a fairly confident, aggressive captain, they tend to attract the confident and aggressive ones. And then once you get to the late 19th and very beginning of the 20th century, and you've now got further stratification of the fleet in terms of you've got battleships and battle cruisers, and then you've got various flavors of cruiser, whether they be armored cruisers, light armored cruisers, protected cruisers, and unprotected cruisers in the run-up to the First World War, or heavy and light cruisers and smaller light cruisers in the interwar period. And then below that, you have the destroyers and the submarines. Then, with that increased stratification, and also a very quickly widening bracket in terms of things like speed, the Royal Navy is essentially carrying on a tradition it's had for a very, very long time, which is the more lunatic and aggressive you are, the smaller craft you tend to be put in charge of. Not necessarily as a mark of disrespect or a downgrade, but simply because small, fast, heavy-hitting craft, there tend to be a reasonable number of them. They don't cost quite as much if you do happen to lose them while you're up to shenanigans, but they can have a completely disproportionate and outsized effect when they're sent in, and the captains will be willing to be sent in them. Whereas, yes, if you put someone like Cochrane in charge of a first rate, he could probably wreak absolute destruction, but the fact it is a first rate and therefore a very guarded asset means he's much less likely to be let loose in such an environment. Whereas if you give him a small frigate or even an unrated ship on that same, let's say, French coast blockade duty, you're going to let him go and attack pretty much whatever he likes. And thus he also therefore has statistically a higher number of chances of proving his point. And the same thing with the destroyers. You know, you having a hyper-aggressive captain on a battleship that is basically supposed to, in theory, stay in a battle line most of the time and only maybe experience one or two true engagements in its lifetime is not a good use of assets. Putting that same captain in a small, fast destroyer that might see combat every other week, that's a very good use of assets. Although, with that said, while I do think, as a rule, it's a good idea, there are a few weaknesses to that, especially, I think, in the Second World War, when big fleet actions by battleships are less likely and individual battleships, or in ones and twos, tend to be around a lot more than fleets of 5, 6 or more. I think at that point you probably would get a lot more margin out of taking the best of the destroyer captains who will stand for it and putting them in as your battleship captains, because then you get things like Dalrymple Hamilton in charge of HMS Rodney. Yeah, that's one truly scary ship. Tankodromis asks, what would be your ideal refit for Warspite? Well, there's a few different ways you could interpret that. You could go with most ideal refit that you could plausibly do, assuming something like money is no object, at the time that she's pulled in for refit or shortly thereafter, still applying future knowledge and so forth. Then there's sort of the next step up, which would be incorporating various weapons systems and so forth that the British could have developed but didn't. And then there's the final ultimate level of ideal refit as, you know, bringing in any and all systems from anything that they could plausibly have had access to in any way, shape or form, like buying in from overseas. But to prevent insanity from completely taking over, if we drill down to just the very basic version of that, i.e. the best refit that you, or the ideal refit that I would have done to Warspite, that's just essentially a much more expensive, slightly future knowledge influenced version of what she got historically. Okay, so in that circumstance, I would start off with a baseline of the Queen Elizabeth and Valiant style refits, which were done obviously historically using some of the knowledge that was brought about thanks to knowing the result of Warspite's refit. So we are applying a little bit of future knowledge or just assuming some pretty far-sighted concepts by the Royal Navy. So that means we're suppressing the 6-inch casement batteries entirely in exchange for a run of 20 4.5-inch guns, 10 per side, 5 twin mounts per side. That gives me much, much better anti-aircraft capability and actually a pretty darn respectable anti-surface capability as well. Now, this is the part where I start increasing the budget and also selectively applying some future knowledge. So I'm going to scrap most of the aircraft handling facilities. Not all. I still would like the ability to operate one aircraft, in part because, hey, you get the float plane Swordfish taking out a U-boat in Narvik. That's a very handy feature to have, especially in the early war period. But I think I can get away with a lot more compact of an aircraft handling facility and maybe even relocate it slightly. Maybe have it built into the very aft of the superstructure with a launch ramp over the aft superfiring turret or something like that. Now that frees up a lot of space and weight amidships. Therefore, as well as having my 4.5-inch guns amidships, I'm going to get a whole bunch of 40mm pom-poms, because bear in mind this is the the most plausible one. So I'm going to stick either a quad or an octuple 40mm pom-pom on top of B turret, and then in kind of a row or maybe a set of rows above the 4.5s and stepped back a bit, so kind of like the US does above and step back for its 5-inch 38s, I'm going to do pom-poms. Now, obviously, it's not the ideal placement in terms of arcs of fire, but I'm simplifying the midship superstructure and obviously, as I said, suppressing to a certain extent the aircraft handling facility. So I should have the room and the weight for it, and that will allow me to introduce a whole bunch more 40mm pom-poms, whether they be quads or octuples, whatever fits space and weight-wise. I am, however, keeping Warspite's original bridge superstructure. Obviously aesthetic choices may vary, but I prefer Warspite's rebuilt bridge superstructure to Queen Elizabeth and Valiant's. So you might be thinking, well, that's not a huge amount of changes yet. But there's more to come, because you see, when Warspite was redone, she had new machinery put in, but because she still had a lot of her 6-inch casemate battery around, and she had to have an anti-aircraft battery, both heavy and medium, it meant they needed more magazine space, and so some of her machinery space was given over to the new anti-aircraft magazines. Whereas in this case, because I'm completely suppressing the casemate batteries, I'm going to be repurposing the 6-inch magazines as 4.5-inch magazines, and I can play around a little bit for 4.5-inch and 40mm magazines in various places. But essentially what I'm doing is not just replacing the machinery, but I'm also maintaining as much as possible the internal volume of the machinery spaces. Because bear in mind, I'm also going to be taking out the underwater torpedo launchers. I'm going to have some other space that I could use for anti-aircraft ammunition storage. And that means I get my small tube boilers, modern 1930s small tube boilers, occupying near enough the same total hull volume as the original machinery set, so I have a lot more power to play with. And yes, that does mean an Italian-style bow extension is going in, so giving Warspite, I'm not sure I'd give her a full flared bow, but maybe a little bit of a forward rake and flare on her bow to cope with the fact she's now probably going to be booking it at 27 knots or so. And I'm also going to be giving her a full Admiralty fire control table as found in the King George V class. So absolutely modern fire control systems. Within the realms of plausibility, the best I can do for her AA is to give her the latest version of the high-angle control system. But essentially, what I'm giving you is obviously all the armor upgrades and bulges and stuff that she had historically, that's all fine. But what I'm giving you is a Warspite with a much heavier, much better directed anti-aircraft suite, and something that is going to have even more accurate guns than she had historically. Looks pretty much not the same, but almost as the same as she does historically, but with that longer bow, we're going to have a ship that's very comfortably capable of being classified as a fast battleship. And that's going to cause all sorts of people very, very horrible nightmares. Physical Removal Enthusiast asks, in Germany, the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty is often considered a strategic blunder by the Kaiser. My question is, what units could have been stationed on Heligoland, and how well would those units have been suited to disrupting coastal shipping? See, now that's quite interesting, because from a British perspective, the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty is very often seen as a massive mistake by the British. Because, well, yes, there was a bit of an ongoing clash between German interests and British interests in the southern part of Africa, and the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty did resolve that. However, ultimately, if the British decided push came to shove out there in the southern half of the African continent, there wasn't really a huge amount the Germans could really do about it at the time that treaty was signed. Britain had by far the larger and more powerful navy and a lot more experience operating in Africa. So the British basically were at least from a British perspective, were neatening things up and making for less bureaucratic nonsense, which I suppose is theoretically a good idea. But they weren't getting anything they couldn't have gotten anyway by other means. The flip side, of course, is they then gave away Heligoland. And from a British perspective, that's an absolute disaster come World War I, because Heligoland sits in an incredibly strategically important position for Imperial Germany. It sits only a few dozen miles away from the Jade Bight, or is that Jade in German? I don't know. It's spelt Jade in English anyway, as well as access from the Elbe, and from the Elbe obviously comes the Kiel Canal as well. So it's essentially just sitting blocking access to the North Sea for basically any German fleet deployment that isn't either sailing from Kiel up and around Denmark, which would be a long and protracted way of doing things, or perhaps if you wanted to base a small fleet in Emden or something like that, you could sneak out that way. But other than that, I mean, the one limitation of Heligoland, as you can tell from this period photo, they have stuck a sort of a reclaimed land airbase to the top left of this photo since then. But it's not exactly the world's largest island, so you're not supporting battle fleets, etc. But to be honest, when you're only 30 miles from your main target zones, you don't need to, And even if you're worried about potentially being subjected to a massive, overwhelming attack by the High Seas Fleet, which is possible because obviously they can get to you in a couple of hours, whereas the Royal Navy based up in Scapa isn't going to be doing that. I mean, it's still relatively defensible. Look at those cliffs. Some guns and some machine gun batteries. You might not be able to stop an enemy fleet bombarding the ever-living daylights out of you, but you can certainly stop troops landing. And at that point, you don't even need necessarily to deploy your latest and greatest and most advanced destroyers and submarines, because a lot of E-types or river classes, etc., they're bigger, but they're not necessarily faster than some of the older types. They're just longer range. But when you're 30 miles away, that doesn't matter. So from a Royal Navy perspective, personally, what I would do is deploy some of my slightly older submarines and slightly older but still fast destroyers and torpedo boats, because then I can keep all the big modern stuff back at home where it's slightly less vulnerable to sudden mass German attacks. But I'm still getting use out of my older stuff, and my older stuff being smaller might actually be more suited for the coastal inshore work of continually poking at the Germans. And I mean, can you imagine the absolute nightmare that the High Seas Fleet would have, based down obviously in Wilhelmshaven, of the potential of these tiny little A and B class, and maybe even the odd C class submarine, constantly trying to poke their way through to start dropping torpedoes and mines right outside my harbour entrance, or even inside the harbour, depending on how adventurous the captains are getting. And every time I sail, I'm going to be reported. At that distance, heck, you build a particularly large observation tower and a good set of binoculars, and you can probably just spy on the harbour directly without even having to leave the island. Or if you think that's pushing it a bit, maybe stick a balloon base and maybe a couple of early aircraft on there, and you can easily do it. The Royal Navy could have made such use of Heligoland if they'd still got it in the run-up to the First World War. Jonathan Smith asks, Dr. Clarke's video on if the Royal Navy had high-pressure boilers cross-pollinated with one of your May Drydock answers about why most European powers went for 15 versus 16-inch guns, and it got me wondering. The South Dakota class was famously squeezed to get in balanced protection against their 16-inch guns, even with the US's relatively compact 600 psi boilers. In your estimation, if the US Navy had, for some reason, had to design them with 300 psi Admiralty 3-drum boilers, how much tonnage from other systems would they have had to give up to still meet the 35,000-ton limit? Now, this isn't going to be an absolutely perfect answer, because obviously there's a lot more to what constitutes machinery weight than just the boilers and turbines. There's, how many auxiliary power units you're going to have, what kind are they, how big are they, all this other kind of stuff for machinery weights. But as a rough comparison, considering that boilers and turbines are going to make up, especially the boilers, the majority of your machinery weight, the King George V class are using up about just under 2,800 tons of their displacement for machinery. The South Dakotas are using up just under 2,700 tons for their machinery. So you're talking about roughly a 100-ton difference. And you might think, well, hang on a minute, that's a really small difference, considering we're talking about very different boilers. But the thing you've got to remember is that the South Dakota class are producing 130,000 shaft horsepower to get up to their 27.5 knots. The King George V's only need 110,000 due to just, basically having a better hull form for it, because the South Dakotas have had to sacrifice various things, including an ideal hull form in terms of length to breadth ratio and so forth, just get everything in. So if we work it out on a approximate tonnage per horsepower basis, we can then retrocalculate roughly how much the displacement of machinery the South Dakotas would need to generate 130,000 shaft horsepower using British-style machinery. So the British are generating roughly 39.3 horsepower per ton of machinery, while the South Dakotas are generating just over 48 horsepower per ton of machinery, which actually lets us calculate things both ways. So in theory, very roughly speaking, if the King George V had used American-style machinery, then their machinery plant would be expected to clock in around 2,300 tons, which would mean a saving compared to the historical of about 500 tons, which that actually would allow the King George V to do quite a number of things, including get its B turret back to being a quad turret, plus a few other upgrades here and there. Whereas the South Dakotas, if they need to generate 130,000 shaft horsepower using 39.3 horsepower per ton, means that their machinery plant is going to clock in at just over 3,300 tons, as opposed to the 2,700-ish, just below that. So we're talking about a net increase of around about 600 tons. And to give you some idea of what that equates to in terms of the South Dakota design specifically, that's roughly equal to every single bit of ship's stores. So all the food, all drinks, everything. All of it adds up to around about 600 tons. So if you had that additional weight in machinery, and that's obviously to say nothing about the additional volume, etc., that would take up, basically to get the ship to come in standard, you'd have no clothes, no replacement equipment, stores, no food, nothing aboard the ship. You'd basically have to bring packed lunches. Or alternatively, because they did look at how much being overweight would affect various aspects of the ship, particularly if they shaved down the armor belt, 600 tons is about equivalent to losing about 3,000 yards on the ship's belt immunity zone, as calculated. So, for example, as designed against her own shells, the South Dakota's armor scheme gave her an immunity zone of about 20,500 yards out to about 26,500 yards. You shave 3,000 yards off of that, so that's now 23,500 to 26,500. So he basically only has a 3,000 yard wide immune zone. That's half her immune zone deleted just by having 600 tons of armor removed. Bert Clothier asks, I noticed a recent article in The Guardian that discussed the discovery of the wreck of HMS Hind in the Orkney Islands. Could you give us a summary of the life and times of the ship, assuming that it's of any real interest? Now, as far as I know, there aren't any pictures or paintings of the 1749 HMS Hind, so you're just going to have to put up with this more generic 24-gun 6th rate frigate picture, because that's what she was, a 24-gunner with 9-pounder guns on her main battery. Now, she's a 24-gunner built to the pattern of the 1745 establishment, and although she's completed in 1749, she doesn't do much for the first few years of her life, and she's only eventually actually commissioned for her first overseas voyage in 1752, when she heads out for Jamaica for a period of 4 years. She's then brought back, paid off, surveyed, and relatively quickly recommissioned, because, hey, the 7 Years' War is on. She then, in 1757, takes a pair of French privateers, l'Ardencourt and Le Difficile, and then at the end of the 1750s, starting in 1758, she's sent to be part of the fleet that attacks French-held Canada. So she's present for initially the siege of Louisbourg and then the siege of Quebec, which she obviously survives both of those. She's then recalled home, and her next item of note in records is sailing with a troop convoy to Lisbon in 1762. She's back in UK waters pretty quickly, so she starts repairing in 1774. The fun part is what they termed a middling repair actually cost almost as much as it did to build her and fit her out in the first place. She then spends the middle part of the 1770s on the North America station, both patrolling and transporting things around. And by 1777, she's back in the UK for a quick refit and is then sent to the Caribbean. But with the American War of Independence in full swing, she's sent back up to the northern climes, where she then takes a number of ships. She takes a sloop, the amusingly named Macaroni, 2 privateers, and an American brig. And until in 1782, she is paid off, refitted as a 10-gun store ship, goes back to North America for a bit. But then by the mid-1780s, she's seen as no longer needed, and she's sold off to become a whaler, and then she goes aground and sinks a few years later, although everybody on board survives. John McCarthy asks, how often did warships and submarines fire a spread of torpedoes at a single target? And how did the crew decide how many to fire and how widely to space them? And overall, what was the typical probability of a hit in such a scenario? So, I mean, it depends how you define a spread. Do you mean a full spread, as in all 4 torpedo tubes are launched, or do you mean a partial spread? You fire 2 or 3 torpedoes out of however many forward tubes you have, as opposed to firing a single torpedo. A single torpedo was actually a relatively rare launch event, unless you were very certain of your fire control solution and you were stalking a very slow convoy. And that's simply because even with the absolute best torpedo fire control systems, like, well, basically the torpedo fire control computer aboard US fleet subs, you still couldn't necessarily be guaranteed of a hit, because the solution that was generated depended on the target ship still just doing whatever it was you thought it was doing in the first place, and your estimates of its course and speed and the range, etc., actually being correct. Because unlike a gunfire control solution, if you missed, you didn't get another shot 30 seconds later and then you get to evaluate very quickly. You're talking about run times of minutes. Unless the enemy is very unobservant, they are then going to completely change their course and speed. And also, torpedoes are very expensive. So paradoxically, even though torpedoes are very expensive, unless you're absolutely certain that you're going to hit, you are going to be firing at least a partial spread, maybe 2 or 3 torpedoes, because every time you fire, it's obviously slightly different bearings, you're increasing the chances of at least one of them hitting. Now, in terms of how many you fire and how widely you space them, this is very much a cost-benefit analysis. The width of the spacing is going to depend partly on how certain you think your fire control solution is. Obviously, the more certain you are, the tighter you're going to space your torpedoes, but also how fast you think the target is going, because if the target is going at 10, 12 knots, then even if you're off by a little bit, let's say you're off by 10%, that's only around about a knot. And if it's, a big freighter, being off by a knot one way or the other, it's probably still going to be in roughly the same place, so a narrow spread is a good idea. Conversely, if you're talking about a very high-speed target, like perhaps a destroyer or a cruiser or something like that, if they're going at, let's say you think 30 knots, that same 10% margin of error is 3 knots either way, a total of 6 knots. They could be considerably further back or considerably further forward. And of course, something like a cruiser or destroyer is more likely to see the target coming and try and evade, either crash, stop, or accelerate. And thus, a wider spread against that kind of target is going to be probably more beneficial. And then it comes down to how valuable is this target to you? How much do you want this kill? Because honestly, even if you look at something that's fairly well supplied with torpedoes, like a Gato class, you're still only carrying 24 torpedoes, and at least 6 of those are in the aft section. So if you fire your full spread of 6, that's 1/3 of all the torpedoes you've got in your bow gone in a single attack. That target better be worth it. So, if you're going after Shinano or Shikaku or Taiho, yeah, absolutely worth sending a full spread of 6 out. If you're going after Generico Maru, probably only worth a couple of torpedoes. And that's with a submarine that's actually carrying quite a few torpedoes. If you're a Type 7, for example, then a full spread, which is only 4 as opposed to 6, still is consuming at least a third, possibly more of your torpedoes, because you only have 14. You've got at least one loaded in the stern tube. If you're carrying any kind of reload, depending on the model of the Type 7, then you've probably got a dozen up front, including the 4 already in the tube. So that's, again, a third of your torpedoes gone, possibly more. If you're a T class, you have 16 torpedoes, so a few more than, a couple more than a Type 7, but 4 of those are in non-reloadable external tubes. So yes, you have a monstrous 10 torpedo initial shotgun spread, but then you have exactly 1 reload, and that reload is only 6 strong. So yes, you can fire 10 torpedoes at something, but it's absolutely got to be worth the effort. So a big enemy capital ship, for instance, big cruiser or battleship, that's worth firing 10 torpedoes. A generic merchant ship, maybe not so much. Baron von Faust asks, following up on my previous Thornycroft destroyer question, could you please tell me anything about their unbuilt interwar designs, such as the T-290? It seems that they planned a lot of leader-sized exports. Yeah, well, large destroyers were very much in vogue in the interwar period, and to be honest, they were planning these export ships for a lot of smaller navies, and as I've said before, personally, I think that slightly more expensive, somewhat larger and more capable versions of standard shipping is actually the better choice for a small navy that can't afford large amounts of ships. So therefore, if you're planning export designs for small navies, you're going to see quite a lot of larger ships. For example, as you asked for the T-290, this is the T-290, apologies for the low quality of the image, but that was a competitor for the Yugoslavian Navy. The Dubrovnik by Yarrow actually won that competition. But this is a rather interesting one because it's fairly small for a destroyer leader. It's 1,700 tons. But it's really designed for speed. It's pushing almost 38 knots, and it's armed with 4 5.5-inch guns, so a pretty hefty armament, 2 triple torpedo launchers, and you can probably see just behind the mainmast also a small aircraft. And we know how well that worked out in reality, but, well, they wanted it. So you've basically got 4 heavy guns, 6 torpedo tubes, some anti-aircraft armament, and this scouting aircraft. And variations on this hull seem to have been offered across a number of different competitions. So, for example, this is T-290. T-291 is basically the same ship offered to Chile, but they took away the aircraft and swapped the 5.5-inch guns out for 4.7-inch guns and added an extra one, so it had 5 guns. There were a bunch of smaller designs that they did for navies that just couldn't afford big destroyers at all. But then if I go a couple of pages forward, there's another Thornycroft leader design which was in the competition, obviously didn't succeed, but it was in the competition that produced the Dutch very large destroyer small cruiser Tromp. And that vessel was almost like a tribal class on steroids. It also had the capability of operating a small seaplane. It had 4 sets of twin 4.7-inch guns, so basically a tribal class layout, but well before the tribals were actually conceived, because this was an early 1930s design. And on top of that, whereas the tribals would have a single set of torpedo launchers, this hypothetical Dutch design, the T548, would have 2 triple launchers plus 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, plus it had between 1.5 inches and 2 inches of armour. So it's not going to protect it against light cruisers, but it will protect it against most destroyer shells. At which point, you're getting into the argument of, is this a very large destroyer or is this a very small cruiser? The weird thing is, actually, for such a influential ship designer, no one seems to have written a definitive history of Thornycroft that I can find with all its various designs included. So given that the National Maritime Museum in London seems to hold that collection, maybe that'll be added to my list of books I probably need to write after doing a lot more research. Not Shaped for Sportive Tricks asks, in Drydock 360 Part 1, you mentioned the county-class cruiser HMS London receiving an overly ambitious refit. Can you please explain what the refit involved, which in your opinion made it go somewhat pear-shaped? Well, here's two views of London from almost the same angle. The top one is what London looked like before her refit, and the bottom one is what she looked like afterwards. Yeah, there's a lot of differences you can probably tell, and they're mostly in the upper section. And this was fundamentally the problem. So when it came to the proposed refits for the London subclass, the second group of counties, while the first group, the Kents, had a 4.5-inch belt slapped on their sides, it was thought that, there's an inch of protection over the London's machinery spaces. We're going to put a 3.5-inch belt over it, but we're going to make that belt taller. So we're going to cover more area with a slightly thinner belt. Now, that's not really much odds either way. The problem came in up top, because as you can see, they stripped away pretty much all the upper superstructure between the guns, and they replaced a relatively small forward superstructure with this massive monolithic thing that was based on that found on the Fiji class cruisers, because this was a late 1930s refit. And as you can also see, they replaced 3 funnels with 2 funnels. The problem is, not only were the funnels of a different number, but they're also in a very different location, which meant you had to change the internal trunking layout from the boilers. And you can probably tell that in the forward superstructure, there's also a big hangar. So whereas on the top photo, you can see aircraft launching and handling facilities are right aft, now they are forward between the funnels, and a lot of the superstructure aft has been cut down. They have the standard county class upgrades, replacing replacing single 4-inch with twin 4-inch and that kind of thing. But they ended up adding over 1,000 tons in weight, so more than a 10% increase in displacement once all was said and done. And a lot of that not only was up top, but the county class, although as I say, with a almost certainly fitted for, but not with armor belts from the start, the way the hull had been designed, because it's obviously a fairly large hull, it had been designed not just to take specific weights and certain stresses, but to take them in a very specific way. And this is a fundamental point of engineering. It's not just about the total load that your structure can withstand, it's also about where that structure actually is located, where those loads are being exerted. Because, well, take, for example, just as a very crude example, a concrete beam. Now, if you take that concrete beam and you put, let's say, 4 1-ton loads, relatively evenly spaced out. So you're basically dividing the column into 5 sections. Now, if you have that 5 tons spread out evenly across the beam, let's say it's fine. If you then take those off, you take a 5-ton weight and you put it dead center in the middle of the beam, and the beam is only supported at either end. And then the beam snaps. That's not because it couldn't take 5 tons. It could take 5 tons, but it could take 5 tons in a certain distribution and not in a point load. The problem with London is that not only had they compromised certain elements of the internal hull layout by having much bigger trunking for these fewer funnels, but they'd also, as you can see, both redistributed and increased the loads on the upper deck. And that meant that the hull couldn't take it, and the upper part of the hull began to crack under the loading as the ship moved through the water. They brought her in, they basically put a bunch of strapping on the upper part of the hull to improve its strength, which sort of worked in that, yes, it increased the strength of the upper part of the hull, but it didn't make those stresses go away. It just meant those stresses moved to the next weakest part of the ship, which turned out to be the lower portion of the hull, the bit underwater. So in 42, when London's on Arctic convoy escorts, she finds there's cracks in the lower hull letting in the Arctic Ocean, which is not a good thing. And then they take her in again, they put a bunch more strapping on the lower portion of the ship, And now, by basically adding a total of, I think it adds up to about 120 to 150 tons of additional strapping, they've essentially brute force increased the strength of the hull to be able to take the stresses of this, increased upper work weight and redistribution of loads. So that's why she's still around for the Amethyst incident and things like that, because they do eventually make her work, but it's not a case of working with what they've got. It's a case of they broke what they got and they ended up having to add a whole ton of extra weight just in structural reinforcement to stop her snapping in half. Lord Druken asks, the Nelson-class battleships arguably have the most unique turret arrangement of any battleship put into service. While several navies did consider a Nelson-style arrangement during the planning stages of battleships that came after them, ultimately, once those ships were actually constructed, most of the time they went with the traditional arrangement of turrets fore and aft. Were there engineering considerations that caused these navies to go with this standard arrangement, or did they just prefer to have a bit of sting in the stern, so to speak? There's a variety of reasons, but it is actually quite interesting to note that of the big five navies, the Japanese and the Americans both came very close to implementing all-forward designs with their next-generation fast battleships in the 1930s, and of course the French actually did. And of the other navies, so the Italians and then obviously the Germans, who built capital ships at around about the same time, obviously the Italians and the Germans notable for not following the treaty restrictions. Obviously, the Japanese didn't either, but there are separate reasons for considering the all-forward layout for them, which is hitting the upper limits of their infrastructure. So, essentially, the G3 and the N3 layouts, and then obviously the Nelson layouts and the intermediates in between, they're designed mostly to save weight. You concentrate the main gun battery all in one place, and then the machinery starts right behind you. That allows you, for various reasons I've tabulated in other dry docks, to shorten your citadel, which in turn means you can have more armour for the same weight over the shorter length, which makes your ship more survivable. That in turn is very useful when you have some kind of external limit on the overall size of your ship. Now, for the Nelson class, obviously, that was the 35,000-ton treaty limit. So this was the British going, if we want to have 9 16-inch guns and decent armour and decent for the time speed, bearing in mind she was quite swift for a battleship of the early 20s, we need to save weight somewhere. This was how you save weight. But when you come into the 1930s, because of advances in metallurgy, advances in machinery, etc., some navies came to the conclusion that you could have a balanced design with the fore and aft turrets, i.e. enough weight had been saved elsewhere that you could have the more traditional layout. Because there were a few issues with the all-forward layout, concentrating all your AA guns aft and your secondaries aft. It basically meant if you were faced with an anti-aircraft attack forward, you didn't actually have that much firepower to deal with it. You'd have to turn to present more firepower from your aft section. There were also some concerns that a hit, perhaps say to the centre of the three turrets, could take out all your armament, although while that was a concern at the time, I personally don't think it's a particularly valid one, because if somebody hits your gun turret or barbette hard enough to set off an explosion that's going to knock out nearby gun turrets, it's probably going to destroy the ship as well, regardless of how many turrets you happen to have in the area. And because the superstructure is further aft, the ships do need to be handled somewhat differently. And the hull form for an all-forward design is somewhat unique as well, because of where you need the wider spaces of the hull and how you taper the hull fore and aft, which, the British were pretty up with their hull designs, which is why they were able to make the Nelsons as efficient as they were. So there's a whole variety of minor reasons that all add up to people not going with the all-forward layout later on because they think they can do without it. The Japanese are looking at it mainly from a weight and length saving perspective, trying to get as much firepower into a small space as possible for what will become the Yamatos, because otherwise they're going to have to massively expand their infrastructure. But in the end, they decide, actually, you know what, we're going to massively expand our infrastructure, and then you get the Yamato layout. Anthony P. asks, what are some examples of naval technologies that evolved or changed the least over the time period that the channel covers? The most obvious example that comes to mind is likely to be something like anchors and mooring. There's been a surprising amount of change in anchor design. The general concept and shape of anchors, yes, is going to be fairly recognizable, but actually there's a lot of different types of anchor, believe it or not, with somewhat different functions. But mooring, yeah, mooring lines, basically, you could take some of the heavier duty mooring lines off a ship of the line and they do as medium scale mooring lines for a battleship or regular scale mooring lines for destroyers and cruisers and that kind of stuff. Related to that, chain really hasn't changed all that much. Capstans, pretty much the only thing that's changed is the power source. The basic principle of a capstan hasn't really altered since they were first made vertical. Masts, actually, their exact nature, whether they be lattice, pole, cage, tripod, etc., may have varied, but the fundamental principle of mast as tall, thin thing upon which things can be placed for the spotting of your opponents, whether that be people or radar or whatever, the fundamental principle behind masts hasn't changed. Camino John asks, when you attend various conferences or read historian trade journals, etc., has there been any talk about how AI is impacting your field in terms of research materials? I ask this because I've connected the following dots. Firstly, using Google Translate, you can literally use your cell phone camera to initiate a live translation of a foreign text into your own language. 2, using AI, you can take excellent translations of known documents, novels, source materials, etc. from a given time frame and form an intelligence base for translating other documents of that time period. And 3, if you combine the two technologies, you could translate historical documents with some degree of accuracy. So I haven't noticed anything in things like Warship International, the annual Warship Journal, etc., yet when it comes to this kind of thing with AI. But at various conferences and historian group chats, this has come up. Now, something like Google Translate, I would say probably not the best. It's a little bit unreliable. It's really only useful for short texts. And as historians and researchers, we tend to be looking at large source documents with an awful lot of text. So when you're looking at AI translation, it tends to be more using good quality scans combined with some of the larger online models like ChatGPT or Claude or something like that. But it's also a very evolving field, very rapidly evolving field, because, I think 2 years ago, I tried to do a translation of some Japanese documentation, and it came out vaguely understandable, but it only was understandable if you knew roughly what it was talking about in the first place, and you could make a few logical leaps. Because at that point, AI mass translation was a very, very, very unreliable affair. You had things like the flying canoe mothership was the AI's best summation of what it was talking about. The only reason I had any clue what on earth it was trying to say was because it then followed up with the name of the flying canoe mothership, the Chitose, which meant it was actually trying to say seaplane carrier. But apparently that particular AI model was pretty terrible at trying to determine what Japanese meant. And then somewhat later, I think it was about 18 months ago, I tried to translate a Japanese document around the Battle of Midway. Now, at that point, the AI had, to be fair, gotten somewhat better, and it was a lot better at translating things contextually. But even so, just one slight error, and it can go off down a complete rabbit hole, again, using, obviously, Japanese sources. There was a section which, the paragraph surrounding it made perfect sense to a reasonable degree. But then it started talking in the middle of the paragraph about the siege of the Red Castle. And I was thinking, the heck are you on about? And I went back over the original Japanese text. And basically what happened was that in the scan, one Japanese character was slightly faded. I think it had not been printed properly in the first place, or it had faded over time. And since the AI couldn't read it, it had just read the single character. Now, I think, because it's still not entirely clear what that character was, but I think the term it was using was kogeki, which means attack, assault, that onslaught, that kind of thing. But it had only read the first character, ko, which also means attack. But it had then seen the following characters, which it interpreted as Red Castle, and then you can see its little AI brain had gone, okay, an attack on a castle, this must mean Kojo, siege. So it translated it as siege of the Red Castle. So it knew there was a missing character. It didn't know what that character was, and it had interpolated that it was Kojo. In actual fact, for those of you who are au fait with Japanese ship names, what it was actually talking about was the attack on the Japanese carrier Akagi, whose name means Red Castle. Now, obviously, to an actual Japanese speaker or reader looking at that line in context, or even to someone looking at the translated text, you could tell that something was wrong and it was actually talking about the attack on the Akagi, but the AI thought it meant the siege of the Red Castle because it had just misread or not read one particular character. But as I said, it's a very rapidly moving field. I put the same text through an AI translation recently and it actually got it right. I think it probably looked in a broader context of what was under discussion and worked out it should be talking about a naval action, not a land battle. And so, these days, this year, 2025, I would say that AI is actually quite helpful in translating foreign language texts. But even then, you do have to be careful, because if you feed the same text into, say, ChatGPT and you ask it to translate a one-page PDF, if you ask it to translate it 3 times, it'll give you 3 different versions of that translation. Now, most of that is just stylistic differences, but if you look at those 3 parallel translations, you can actually see if you read one of them in exclusion, you could get the slightly wrong impression. So even with that, it's better to either use the same AI translator several times, compare and contrast, and make sure that there's not some weird differentiation in one of the translations, or use multiple AI platforms and do a compare and contrast, because obviously they're using slightly different models, or better still, get a translation broadly done by AI, and if there's anything at all that jumps out at you as partly suspicious, get an actual native speaker to look at it and go, is this actually what it's saying? And that means that at the moment, although AI translation of foreign language sources is quite useful for historians, I would say it's still a little bit dangerous for, if you like, Joe Public. Simply because I would say nowadays 90-95% of the AI translation, as long as you've got a good translation model, will probably be correct. But you can get contextual or factual errors slipping into a translation that you may not notice, that a trained historian who's done this a lot might pick up. But if it's only maybe just about flagging on a historian's radar and he's going, right, I need to find some clarification for this, it might bypass a lot of other people, and then they will accept that bit and that they could be led off down the wrong path. But I mean, we've come in 2 years from Flying Canoe Mothership to almost spot on. So, a year or 2 down the line, who knows, it might actually be perfectly fine. Nicholas Ressar asks, in the novel Dracula, the Demeter set sail with 5 hands, 2 mates, a cook, and the captain. Is this a normal crew for a small merchant ship? Well, that's a total crew of 9. That is very small. Even for a small merchant ship in the 19th century, it's unusually small. I understand it's supposed to be, the Demeter's supposed to be sailing with a skeleton crew, but even then, you could probably manage a small trade ship with 9 crew, albeit obviously you're probably only going to have half a dozen of them actually working the ship at any one point. But you essentially got just 1 shift on that crew. So I think in most circumstances, you would be sailing kind of ancient Roman, ancient Greek style, where you'd leave a port in the morning and you would just sail down the coast and find another port to pull into at night, because you do not have the men at that stage with any kind of ship that could reasonably be called a seagoing merchant vessel to operate the multiple duty shifts that you'd need to sail on through the night. Ideally, you'd want a crew at minimum 15 to 20, even for a small ship, to be able to just continuously sail from point A to point B. Reaver's Rambling Recess asks, following along with the British carrier fleet in the Pacific, when the rise of the Japanese kamikaze attacks became apparent and the loss of US carriers was painfully rife, or at least their disablement, if national pride had been set aside in both directions, could the British have done better to withstand being at the tip of the spear on the amphibious operations with their, comparatively speaking, kamikaze-proof carriers and better developed combat air patrols? Or is there something that would render this less effective than one might otherwise hope? And separately, with the rise of YouTube Shorts apparently gutting many long-form channels, have you considered revisiting the format, perhaps as a clearinghouse for common FAQ questions? Well, spoiler alert, this is kind of what Admiral Halsey wanted the British Pacific Fleet to be doing, which we'll kind of see as I continue the British Pacific Fleet video development series, although there's not a lot of World War II left to cover, but there you go. Now, yes, there are ways that could have been done. So it would have obviously involved putting the British carriers in immediate frontline danger, but, well, that's what warships are for, and ultimately, yes, they are much better suited to defending themselves. So if I was going to do that, then I would actually take a leaf out of the sort of some of the cooperation between Victorious and Saratoga at the end of 1942. So you'd transfer the Avengers, the strike aircraft, and whatever other strike aircraft, Barracudas, Fireflies, etc., transfer those off of the British carriers onto American carriers and basically stock the British carriers pretty much entirely with fighters. You know, you've got Seafires, you've got Corsairs, you've got Hellcats. Fill them with them, so you've got probably about 50 or so fighters per carrier. And you put them on the front line, as close to the Japanese positions as is reasonable without making it too obvious. And then when the Japanese kamikaze attacks come in, or if their kamikaze attacks are coming in off axis, you put them on that flank. So when the Japanese kamikaze attacks come in, they see a bunch of carriers and they think, aha, we shall go in and attack these carriers because that is our job. Except that these carriers, if the British Pacific Fleet is operating as a coherent force, have probably got 2-3 dozen aircraft on combat air patrol at any given time and plenty more fighters ready to go on the deck. So they're going to cut through incoming kamikaze waves quite nicely, and if there's prolonged mass kamikaze strikes, you can cycle more fighters through. Of course, US carriers could contribute some combat air patrol as well, and then at the same time, the US carriers that are sitting slightly further back from the line of Japanese attack, with the British as well as their own strike aircraft on board, can launch even bigger strike packages in retaliation. So the British carriers, absorbing most of the kamikaze strikes with their combat air patrol, tanking the one or two that make it through, and then as the kamikaze strike exhausts itself, then the US carriers send a massive counter-strike against the Japanese airfields that launched said kamikaze strike to hopefully stop it from happening again. With regards to the YouTube Shorts, I've thought about that kind of, maybe doing it as short FAQs here and there. The last time I put it to the channel membership, they weren't particularly in favour of it. I might put it to the channel membership again once I'm back from Japan, because I have discovered two things. Firstly, shorts actually now come with an option that you can untick as a creator, which means that if it stays ticked, it publishes it to your subscription feed. So all you guys who are nice loyal subscribers see the short as it comes up, which obviously I can understand could get very annoying if I'm doing like one a day or something. But I can untick that. and then it just becomes part of the shorts ecosystem without bothering the subscribers who don't want to see it. And that potentially would be a way to go about doing things. And the other reason I've been thinking about perhaps revisiting that is that there has been at least a noticeable rise in my feed, I don't know if it's a noticeable rise across YouTube, of people doing naval history shorts of various descriptions, and some of them are okay, but some of them are frankly terrible. Repeating, they're getting hundreds of thousands of views. I mean, with shorts, that probably means they're earning like 6p, so it's not a living, but they're getting hundreds of thousands of people watching them, at least according to the view count, and they're repeating some of the oldest, tiredest, most ridiculous myths in naval history. So maybe someone needs to go out there and correct it. And finally, for this half of the Patreon Drydock, Ash the Lego Guy asks, in the period the channel covers, was there a Navy use ship that was designed to put everything towards speed and or maneuverability, with armour, if any, and firepower as an afterthought or token use? I would include special operations or cargo or blockade running as a primary mission of such a ship, but exclude pressed civilian vessels like ocean liners or tankers. Yes, there absolutely have been over time. You've got blockade runners of various descriptions, specifically commissioned into navies. The Prussian Navy had blockade runners during the Franco-Prussian War. The Confederates had Confederate blockade runners during the American Civil War, and so on and so forth. You have ships like the Abdiel-class mine layers here. Now, you might think, hang on, these look relatively well armed. Well, they've got 6 4-inch guns on 2,500 tons. These things are the size and displacement of very large destroyers for World War II, and they have an armament that's more befitting a sloop. Well, that's because they're mine layers, and they're just designed to go incredibly fast. Some of the designs the US Navy came up with in the early 1920s, some of the early forms of the Lexington and Omaha classes could be seen as that, because they were driving for 35 knots and almost prepared to sacrifice virtually anything else to get it. They obviously ended up having to back off of that somewhat, but as designed, some of the initial efforts in that regard were pretty speed-oriented. You could even make a case for the Italia-class ironclads, because they do have a fairly heavy armament for their time, but they completely abandoned the traditional concept of armour in favour of, a novel multicellular hull layout. But part of the attraction of dumping all the armour weight is just to go, we're going to be, for the time, incredibly fast for a capital ship. And that wraps up the first half of the Patreon Drydock, so hope you've enjoyed it, and hope to see you in part 2.